Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The lamplight had been flickering for 3 days before I first saw him. I should have fixed that sensor months ago, when Grandma Alice was still alive and would scold me about the maintenance during my weekend visits. Now, sitting alone in her creaking farmhouse with nothing but the insurance paperwork and my laptop for company, that erratic yellow glow had become the rhythm of my insomnia. Flash, pause, darkness. Flash, pause, darkness. Like a dying heartbeat against the wraparound porch. The advertising agency had given me bereavement leave, though they'd probably expected me to use it for something more productive than camping out in the middle of nowhere, 40 minutes from the nearest grocery store. Mom had flown to Phoenix to settle Dad's affairs, another inheritance mess, another round of family obligations, leaving me to sort through decades of accumulated memories in Alice's isolated sanctuary. That's what she'd always called it, her sanctuary. The first night the man appeared, I was nursing my third cup of coffee at 11 p.m., scrolling through email campaigns that felt increasingly meaningless. The automatic light triggered its stuttering dance, and there he was, a silhouette on the far end of the porch, motionless as a fence post. My chest tightened. I'd locked the gate, posted no trespassing signs. The nearest neighbor lived 2 miles down a dirt road that barely qualified as navigable. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped outside, the screen doors spring groaning behind me. The November air cut through my thin sweater, sharp with the scent of decomposing leaves and distant wood smoke. "Hey," I called out, my voice smaller than intended. "Can I help you?" The figure didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. In the weak pool of the sensor light, I could make out the outdated cut of his dark suit, the narrow lapels and high-waisted trousers that belonged to a different era. His face remained shadowed, tilted downward as if studying something on the weathered planks. "Sir, this is private property." Still nothing. The lamplight flickered again, longer this time, and when it steadied, he was gone. I swept the flashlight beam across the entire porch, then down into the yard where Alice's cats, now my cats, congregated around their food bowls. Whiskers and Marmalade looked up at me with that particular feline expression of mild annoyance, as if my paranoia was interrupting their evening routine. I told myself it was a homeless man, someone seeking shelter who'd moved on when confronted. Rural areas attracted drifters, especially as winter approached. Nothing supernatural about that, nothing that couldn't be explained by logic and circumstance. But I double-checked every lock before going to bed. The second night, I was ready for him. I'd positioned myself by the living room window with a clear view of the porch, camera phone charged and recording. When the light began its familiar spastic pattern, I held my breath and waited. He materialized exactly as before, though that wasn't quite the right word. He didn't appear so much as become visible, like a photograph developing in slow motion. The same antiquated suit, the same bowed posture. But this time, I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. A white porcelain plate hovered 18 inches above the porch railing, suspended in empty air. The man reached up, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic, and withdrew something from the floating dish with what appeared to be a silver spoon. He brought it to his mouth with ceremonial precision, chewing slowly, savoring whatever substance he'd collected. Even through the window glass, I could see the faint phosphorescent glow emanating from the plate's contents, pulsing like bioluminescent algae. I fumbled with my phone, hands trembling as I tried to zoom in while maintaining the recording. The man continued his strange meal, spoonfuls of light disappearing between his lips while the plate remained perfectly stationary in midair. When I checked the footage later, it showed only a translucent blur against the porch backdrop. No plate, no phosphorescent food, just a vague human-shaped distortion that could have been atmospheric moisture or a smudge on the lens. The third night, I didn't wait by the window. Instead, I called my mother in Phoenix, desperate for a rational voice to anchor me to reality. The phone rang 4 times before her voicemail picked up, her cheerful message about being busy with estate matters and promising to return calls soon. I hung up without leaving a message, unsure how to articulate what I was experiencing without sounding completely unhinged. I tried my college roommate Matt, then my sister Sarah, then my ex-girlfriend Jennifer. Nobody answered. It was as if the entire world had conspired to leave me alone with whatever was happening on Alice's porch. When the lamplight began flickering at its appointed time, I forced myself to stay in the kitchen, washing dishes that were already clean and reorganizing Alice's spice rack by alphabetical order. I would not look outside. I would not feed this delusion or hallucination or whatever psychological break I was experiencing. But the cats were agitated, whiskers paced between the back door and the window, emitting low, guttural sounds I'd never heard before. Marmalade had disappeared entirely, probably hiding under Alice's bed where she'd retreated during thunderstorms. And then I smelled it, a sharp, citrusy fragrance that reminded me of bergamot tea mixed with lemon zest. It drifted through the house despite every window being closed and locked, growing stronger until it seemed to emanate from the very walls. My vision blurred around the edges. The kitchen clock's ticking became impossibly loud, then faded to silence. The last thing I remembered was the strange sweetness on my tongue, like dissolving candy, and the sensation of walking towards something important that I couldn't quite recall. I woke up in the backyard at dawn, my pajamas soaked with dew, and my bare feet caked with mud. 3 hours had passed according to my watch, though it felt like minutes. There were no footprints leading from the house to where I lay, just my own body in the middle of Alice's neglected vegetable garden, surrounded by withered tomato plants and the skeletal remains of summer herbs. The fourth night changed everything. I decided to stay awake, really awake, armed with caffeine pills and a thermos of black coffee. I positioned chairs at both the front and back doors, determined to catch myself if I started sleepwalking again. This time, I'd document everything with multiple cameras, create evidence that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized away. But when the familiar flickering began, I wasn't on the porch or in the yard. I was standing in Alice's kitchen, staring at the old oak table where she'd served me countless Sunday dinners throughout my childhood. A porcelain plate sat in the center of the table, identical to the one I'd seen floating outside. It hadn't been there 60 seconds earlier when I'd passed through to refill my coffee. The doors remained locked, the windows sealed, yet here it was, perfectly white china decorated with delicate blue flowers, containing perhaps 2 ounces of some luminescent substance that shifted between green and gold, like aurora borealis captured in liquid form. The citrus scent hit me immediately, stronger than before, accompanied by something else. Something organic and earthy that reminded me of the mushrooms Alice used to forage in the woods behind the property. My grandmother had always possessed an uncanny knowledge of which fungi were edible and which were poisonous, claiming her own grandmother had taught her the difference when she was barely old enough to walk. Some things can't be learned from books, she'd always said when I'd ask about her mysterious expertise. Some knowledge gets passed down in ways that modern folks don't understand anymore. I circled the table slowly, studying the plate from every angle. The substance inside rippled without any external disturbance, its glow intensifying and fading in a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. When I leaned closer, the sweet fragrance became overwhelming, and I felt that familiar dissolution of time and space beginning at the edges of my consciousness. This time I fought it. I bit down hard on my tongue until I tasted blood, used the sharp pain to maintain awareness even as the kitchen walls seemed to pulse and breathe around me. Through sheer force of will, I managed to stumble backwards, putting distance between myself and the hypnotic plate. That's when I saw him again. The man in the vintage suit stood just beyond the kitchen doorway, no longer confined to the porch or the uncertain boundary between inside and outside. He was definitely inside now, in Alice's sanctuary, close enough that I could distinguish individual features despite the dim lighting. His face was gaunt but not unpleasant, with sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes that reflected the phosphorescent glow like dark mirrors. His skin had the pale, waxy quality of old photographs, and when he smiled, which he did upon noticing my attention, I could see that his teeth were perfectly white but somehow wrong, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. He gestured toward the plate with one elegant, long-fingered hand. An invitation. An offering. I shook my head, backing toward the rear door while keeping my eyes fixed on his unnatural stillness. He didn't seem threatening exactly, but there was something deeply unsettling about his patience, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for my cooperation. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. His smile widened, revealing more of those borrowed teeth, and he raised the silver spoon I'd seen him use before. With deliberate slowness, he dipped it into the luminescent substance and brought it toward my direction, holding it steady like someone offering medicine to a reluctant child. The scent intensified until breathing became difficult. My vision began to fragment, splitting the kitchen into overlapping images like a broken kaleidoscope. I could feel myself starting to lose the battle against whatever narcotic effect the substance produced, my carefully maintained awareness slipping away despite my desperate attempts to stay grounded. Just before consciousness abandoned me completely, I noticed something that chilled me more than anything else I'd experienced. There were muddy footprints leading from the back door to where I stood, and they matched the size and tread pattern of my own bare feet. When I woke this time, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the empty plate before me, and the taste of citrus and earth still coating my tongue. According to the microwave clock, it was nearly noon. I'd lost almost 8 hours. The worst part wasn't the missing time or the lingering chemical sweetness in my mouth. The worst part was the growing certainty that this wasn't the first time I'd eaten from that plate. Maybe not even the second or third. How long had this been happening? How many nights had I awakened in the yard with no memory of going outside, assuming it was some stress-induced sleepwalking episode, rather than the aftermath of consuming an unknown psychoactive substance that appeared and disappeared from my grandmother's kitchen? I called Mom again, this time leaving a rambling voicemail about needing to know more about Alice's final weeks, about whether she'd mentioned anything unusual before her death. Had there been visitors? Strange occurrences? Any family history of mental illness that I should be aware of? She called back within an hour, her voice tight with concern as she asked if I was eating properly and getting enough sleep. According to her, Alice had been perfectly lucid until the end, though she'd mentioned something about keeping the old agreements in her final days. When pressed for details, Mom admitted she'd assumed it was related to property deeds or inheritance paperwork. She did say something odd, though, Mom added after a thoughtful pause. Right before I left for Phoenix, she told me to make sure you understood that some responsibilities can't be abandoned, only transferred. I figured she was talking about the cats or the house maintenance. That night, I didn't bother with cameras or chairs or any attempt to remain conscious when the lamplight began its erratic dance. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and waited for the plate to appear, studying my reflection in the dark window glass, while the phosphorescent scent gradually filled the room. When the man in the antique suit finally materialized beside me, I didn't flinch or try to run. He looked exactly as he had before, ageless, patient, and somehow familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. "You knew her," I said, not really asking. "You knew Alice." His nod was barely perceptible, but definitive. He gestured again toward the plate, which had appeared without fanfare while I'd been watching his face. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked. For the first time, his expression shifted from benign patience to something approaching sadness. He pointed toward the window, then made a sweeping motion that encompassed the entire property. His meaning was unclear, but somehow ominous, as if my refusal would result in consequences that extended far beyond personal discomfort. I stared at the luminescent substance, watching it pulse and shift like a living thing. The rational part of my mind cataloged all the reasons this couldn't be happening. Hallucinations brought on by isolation and grief. Possible gas leaks causing neurological symptoms. Some kind of delayed stress reaction to Alice's death and the life changes it had triggered. But rationality felt increasingly irrelevant in the face of physical evidence I couldn't dismiss. The muddy footprints were real. The missing time was real. The taste in my mouth and the strange dreams that weren't quite dreams were real. "How long?" I whispered. The man held up his hand, fingers spread wide. 5, then again, 10, then a third time. though he only extended 3 fingers on the final count. 13 times. 13 times I'd eaten from the phosphorescent plate without remembering. 13 times I'd awakened in the yard or at the table with gaps in my memory, and Alice's old agreements, somehow binding me to rituals I'd never consciously chosen. I thought about my grandmother's extensive knowledge of local flora, her mysterious expertise with wild mushrooms and medicinal plants. I thought about the isolation of this property, perfect for cultivating things that required privacy and protection from prying eyes. I thought about family responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned, only transferred from one generation to the next. The man waited with infinite patience while I processed the implications of my inheritance. Not just a house and some cats, but something far more complex and binding. Something that required regular feeding, careful tending, and absolute secrecy. As I lifted the spoon toward my mouth, I wondered if Alice had ever sat at this same table during her final weeks, making the same calculated decision to accept, rather than resist whatever ancient compact she'd maintained for decades. Had she felt this same mixture of revulsion and resignation? This terrible understanding that some burdens were too dangerous to abandon? The phosphorescent substance tasted like starlight and soil, like promises made in languages I'd never learned but somehow understood. As consciousness began to fade around the edges, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the kitchen window. A man in his 30s, alone in an inherited house, slowly becoming something his grandmother had been before him. When I wake tomorrow, if I wake tomorrow as myself rather than something else wearing my face, I'll need to call the advertising agency and extend my bereavement leave indefinitely. After all, maintaining Alice's sanctuary requires more time and attention than I'd initially realized. Some agreements, it seems, are truly unbreakable, and some responsibilities can only be transferred to those foolish enough to accept their inheritance without asking the right questions first. Story 2. The rain began at 2:47 a.m., and with it came the memories I'd spent 15 years trying to forget. I'd been working late in what used to be my childhood bedroom, now converted into the heart of my design studio. The familiar walls that once held Star Wars posters now displayed mood boards and color palettes for corporate clients. The transformation felt complete until tonight, when the past decided to announce its unwelcome return through the rhythmic drumming of water against the renovated windows. The first unusual thing was the silence between the thunder. Living alone in this house for 3 years had taught me its every creak and whisper, but tonight something felt muted, as if the very air had thickened around the building. I pushed back from my drafting table, stretching muscles that protested against another 16-hour workday, when the headlights first appeared. 2 perfect circles of amber light pierced through the rain-streaked glass of my studio window, stationary at the mouth of the driveway. Not unusual in itself. Neighbors sometimes used our wide entrance to turn around. But these lights didn't move. They simply waited, patient as a predator. I moved to the window, pressing my face against the cool glass. Through the distortion of raindrops, I could make out the familiar silhouette that made my breath catch in my throat. The boxy shape, the slightly rusted bumper, the way the passenger side sat just a fraction lower than the driver's side, details I'd memorized during countless family trips to soccer practice and grocery stores. The old beige minivan, Dad's minivan. Except Dad had been gone for 7 years now, and the van had been sold at the estate sale along with everything else I couldn't bear to keep. I'd watched a young mother drive it away, her toddler waving from the back seat where I used to sit, and I'd felt nothing but relief that another piece of my complicated past was finally disappearing down the street. Yet there it sat, engine off but headlights blazing, as if it had never left. My rational mind immediately began constructing explanations. Someone had bought the same model, same color. Someone was lost and using our driveway to check their phone. Someone was having car trouble and would be gone by morning. But as I stared through the rain, these reasonable thoughts began to fracture against the growing certainty that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The driver was wrong. Even through the storm and the glare of headlights, I could see a figure behind the wheel, but where a face should have been, there was only a thick, roiling fog that seemed to pour from within the cab itself. The mist pressed against the windows from the inside, creating strange patterns that shifted and swirled with their own unnatural current. It was as if the van had become a vessel for something that existed between states, not quite solid, not quite vapor. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but my fingers hesitated over the numbers. What would I tell them? That my dead father's sold minivan was parked in my driveway with a fog person behind the wheel? They'd suggest I'd been working too hard, drinking too much coffee, spending too much time alone in a house full of ghosts. Instead, I decided to turn on the exterior floods. The moment the powerful LED fixtures illuminated the driveway, the van simply wasn't there anymore. Not driving away, not fading gradually, just gone, as if it had been edited out of reality by an invisible hand. The rain continued to fall on empty asphalt, and the only evidence of the vehicle's presence was the lingering scent of exhaust that somehow reached me through the sealed windows of the house. I stood there for 20 minutes, watching the empty space where the van had been, trying to convince myself that exhaustion had finally caught up with my overworked mind. When I finally turned off the floods and returned to my desk, the amber glow was back, closer this time, much closer. The van now sat just beyond the edge of the front yard, its headlights casting long shadows across the newly landscaped garden I'd installed last spring. The fog figure behind the wheel seemed denser now, more defined, though still impossibly indistinct. And for the first time, I noticed that despite the heavy rain, no water seemed to touch the vehicle's surface. Droplets passed through it as if it were made of concentrated moonlight. This time I didn't reach for the lights. Instead, I found myself moving through the house, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. My bare feet whispered across the hardwood floors as I made my way to the living room, where the large picture window offered an unobstructed view of the front lawn. The van had moved again. It now sat at the edge of the walkway leading to my front door, maybe 30 feet from where I stood. The headlights blazed directly through the living room window, casting everything in stark relief. My furniture became a landscape of hard shadows and silver highlights, transforming the familiar space into something alien and threatening. But it was what I saw in those shadows that made my breath catch. There, pressed against the glass from the outside, was the outline of a hand, not quite touching the surface, but close enough that I could see the individual fingers splayed wide as if seeking warmth. The hand was translucent, like the rest of the fog figure, but substantial enough to block the light in places, creating a negative space that was somehow more terrifying than a solid presence would have been. I forced myself to move closer to the window, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The hand remained motionless as I approached, but I could feel something radiating from it, not heat or cold, but a kind of desperate hunger that made my skin crawl. When I was close enough to see my own reflection in the glass, the hand suddenly pressed forward, flattening against the window with a wet sound that shouldn't have been possible. The fog began to seep through the glass, not around the edges where weather stripping might have failed, but directly through the solid pane as if it were made of tissue paper. Thin tendrils of mist curled into my living room, bringing with them the scent of wet concrete and something else, something organic and familiar that I couldn't quite place. I stumbled backward, knocking over a side table that sent a ceramic lamp crashing to the floor. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held me transfixed, and I ran to the nearest light switch, flooding the room with warm LED brightness. The van vanished again, but the fog remained for several seconds longer, wisps of it still clinging to the ceiling before dissipating like morning mist. The window showed no sign of having been penetrated, no residue or condensation to mark where the impossible had briefly become real. But the smell lingered. That organic scent that teased at the edges of memory, familiar, yet wrong. It reminded me of the way Dad used to smell when he came home from his weekend fishing trips. Lake water and mud and something else I'd never been able to identify as a child. Something like decay. I spent the rest of the night in my studio with every light in the house blazing, watching the empty driveway through 3 different windows. The van didn't return, but I could feel it waiting somewhere just beyond my field of vision, patient as the rain that continued to fall until dawn. When morning finally arrived, gray and soggy, I forced myself to venture outside to inspect the driveway for tire tracks or any other evidence of the night's visitation. The asphalt was clean, recently washed by the storm, with no indication that any vehicle had been there at all. But as I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye at the edge of the front lawn. There, pressed deep into the rain-softened soil, were tire tracks. Not just any tire tracks, but a perfect circle burned into the grass. The earth beneath charred black as if subjected to intense heat. And within that circle, smaller burns formed a pattern I didn't recognize. Symbols that looked almost like letters from an alphabet I'd never seen. I knelt beside the marks, studying their precise geometry. They were too perfect to be accidental, too complex to be natural. As I watched, rain began to pool in the deepest burns, and something extraordinary happened. The water began to glow, not brightly, just a faint phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe in the rain light, suggesting meanings that danced just beyond comprehension. I reached out to touch one of the marks, but my hand stopped inches away, repelled by the same hungry energy I'd felt from the fog figure's hand against my window. That's when I heard it. The distant rumble of an engine that needed a tune-up, the particular wheeze of a transmission that had never quite worked right. The sound was coming from the direction of the street, growing closer with each passing second. I looked up from the symbols to see the beige minivan turning into my driveway, moving slowly but inexorably toward where I knelt. In daylight, I could see details that had been hidden by darkness and rain. The van looked exactly as I remembered it, down to the small dent in the rear bumper from where Dad had backed into Mrs. Peterson's mailbox. But the windows were completely opaque, filled with the same roiling fog that had leaked into my house during the night. As it approached, I found myself unable to move, transfixed by the impossible sight of a vehicle that should have been gone, driven by something that shouldn't exist. The van came to a stop just a few feet away, engine still running, headlights dark in the gray morning light. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the driver's side door began to open. The fog poured out like water from a broken dam, spreading across the ground with unnatural speed. It engulfed my feet first, then my legs, rising with each second until I was standing waist-deep in mist that felt neither warm nor cold, but somehow hungry. Through the swirling gray, I could see a shape emerging from the van. Tall, human in proportion but completely without features. As if someone had tried to sculpt a person from memory and given up halfway through. The fog figure moved toward me with deliberate steps, and as it drew closer, that familiar scent grew stronger. Not just lake water and mud now, but the full bouquet of decomposition, of things that had been underwater too long. And suddenly I remembered where I'd smelled it before. The fishing trips, Dad's weekend excursions to the lake, from which he'd return Sunday nights with an empty cooler, and that particular odor clinging to his clothes. The trips that had started when I was 8 and continued until I left for college. The trips I'd never been invited on, despite my repeated requests to go along. The trips that had ended abruptly 3 weeks before his fatal car accident on a rain-slicked highway. The fog figure stood before me now, close enough that I could see the constant shifting of its features, as if trying to settle into a familiar pattern but failing again and again. When it raised one translucent hand toward my face, I caught a glimpse of something beneath the mist. The flash of a fishing hook, the glint of metal weights, the pale gleam of bones that had been underwater for far too long. That's when I understood. The lake, the weekend trips, the smell, the accident that happened 3 weeks after the trip stopped, on a night when Dad was driving home from somewhere he'd never been before, somewhere that had made him smell like a different kind of water entirely. The fog figure leaned closer, and I could feel its breath, if something made of mist could be said to breathe, against my cheek. It carried the scent of questions that would never be answered, of secrets that had followed him into whatever lake had claimed more than just his weekends. But as understanding dawned, as the pieces of a puzzle I'd never known existed began to fall into place, the fog began to dissipate. The figure wavered like heat shimmer, becoming less distinct with each passing second. The van's engine sputtered and died, and the whole scene began to fade like a photograph left too long in sunlight. By the time the mist cleared completely, I was alone in my front yard, kneeling beside a circle of burned earth that was already beginning to cool. The van was gone. The fog figure was gone. And the only evidence that any of it had happened was the lingering scent of lake water and the perfect geometric precision of symbols burned into soil that would never grow grass again. I stood slowly, brushing dirt from my knees, and looked back at the house where I'd grown up, where I'd chosen to make my adult life despite everything it represented, where I'd convinced myself that renovations and fresh paint could transform the past into something manageable. But some transformations work both ways. As I walked back toward the front door, I found myself wondering about the lake Dad used to visit, about what he might have found there, or what might have found him, about whether some secrets are too heavy to stay buried underwater forever, and whether the beige minivan would return tomorrow night when the rain began to fall again. Because something told me this was far from over. Something told me that 15 years wasn't nearly long enough for certain kinds of debts to be forgotten. Something told me that the next time the van appeared, I might not be watching from the safety of my window. I might be invited to take a ride. Story 3. The house breathed differently when empty. I'd lived in this Melbourne townhouse for 18 years, but the first night alone revealed sounds I'd never noticed. The settling of timber that groaned like old bones, the whisper of air through gaps I couldn't locate, the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock that seemed to skip beats when I wasn't listening directly. My parents had left that morning for their anniversary trip to Tasmania, and the silence they'd taken with them felt heavier than their presence ever had. By midnight, thirst drove me from my room. The stairs descended into darkness thick as velvet, each step familiar beneath my bare feet. 12 steps down to the landing, turn left, 12 more to the kitchen. I'd counted them thousands of times as a kid, racing up and down until Mom would shout about wearing holes in the carpet. The 13th step, the one that creaked, always came at the turn, just before the kitchen door, but I never reached it. The kitchen light spilled a pale rectangle across the hardwood floor, and there, silhouetted against the white cabinets, stood a figure. My height, my build, my posture, shoulders slightly hunched, head tilted as if listening to something just beyond hearing. The figure faced away from me, perfectly still, edges soft and unfocused like a photograph taken with an unsteady hand. My foot found the 13th step. Creak. The head turned. Not the body, just the head, rotating with mechanical precision until it faced completely backward. No features were visible in the silhouette, just the suggestion of a face angled toward me with impossible geometry. The neck had twisted too far, farther than human anatomy allowed, yet the motion appeared effortless, natural. I blinked. The kitchen was empty. Light still blazed from the overhead fixture, casting sharp shadows that held no trace of the figure I'd seen. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. Water dripped from the faucet into the stainless steel sink, a sound that had annoyed Dad for months, but which he'd never gotten around to fixing. I stood on the 13th step for several minutes, studying every corner of the kitchen, waiting for movement that never came. The logical explanations lined up in my mind. Fatigue, stress from being alone, shadows playing tricks in peripheral vision. I'd been working late shifts at the warehouse all week, sleeping poorly, existing on coffee and convenience store sandwiches. But the image lingered with photographic clarity. That impossible rotation, the way the silhouette had listened to the creaking step as if it had been waiting for exactly that sound. I got my water and returned upstairs, avoiding the 13th step on the way up. Sleep came in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard footsteps ascending the stairs, measured, deliberate, pausing at the 13th step before continuing upward. Each time I jerked awake and held my breath, listening to the house's nocturnal symphony, but the footsteps never reached my door. The second night brought variations. This time I descended quietly, avoiding the creaking step entirely by stepping over it. The kitchen was dark, empty, normal. I flicked on the light and moved to the refrigerator, but peripheral vision caught movement in the hallway beyond, a shadow passing across the far wall, too quick to follow directly but unmistakably human in shape. I called out, voice cracking slightly. "Hello?" The house swallowed my words without echo. I explored every room on the ground floor, turning on lights, checking windows and doors. Everything was locked, untouched, exactly as I'd left it. The alarm system showed no breaches, yet the sensation of being observed never lifted, a weight pressing between my shoulder blades like invisible eyes tracking my movement. When I finally returned upstairs, I heard the footsteps again, starting from the kitchen, climbing with patient rhythm. I counted along. 1, 2, 3, 11, 12. Creak. Silence. I lay rigid in my bed, covers pulled to my chin like a child, waiting for the footsteps to resume. They never did. Whatever climbed those stairs always stopped at the 13th step, as if that creaking sound marked some boundary between its world and mine. By the fourth night, exhaustion had sharpened the edges of everything. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds carried further, and the house itself felt larger, corridors stretching longer than memory suggested, rooms containing corners that hadn't existed before. I'd started mapping the layout obsessively, counting steps and measuring distances, but the numbers never matched. The hallway outside my room was 23 feet long according to my measuring tape, but 27 paces when I walked it. The staircase had 24 steps, but I'd been counting 25 since childhood, including the creaking one. Even the kitchen seemed to shift subtly, appliances occupying slightly different positions each time I entered, as if the entire house was slowly rotating around some invisible axis. I tried staying awake entirely, consuming coffee until my hands shook and my vision blurred. But micro-sleeps ambushed me, seconds-long lapses where my eyes would close and immediately snap open to the sound of footsteps that hadn't been there a moment before. Always the same pattern, starting from somewhere below, climbing steadily, pausing at the 13th step. During one of these micro-sleeps, I dreamed I was the one climbing. My bare feet found each step automatically, muscle memory guiding me through the familiar ascent. But when I reached the 13th step and heard it creak beneath my weight, I looked down and saw my own body lying asleep in bed above. The perspective was impossible, looking down at something that should have been above me, yet felt entirely natural in the dream logic. I woke with a start to find myself standing at the top of the stairs. My feet were dirty, small pieces of debris from the kitchen floor stuck to the soles. I had no memory of leaving my bed, no recollection of the descent and climb that must have preceded this moment. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed 3 a.m., its sound drifting up through the house like a funeral dirge. That was when I noticed the new hallway. Where the stairs turned at the landing, a corridor extended to the left that I'd never seen before. It was identical to the others in the house. Same carpet, same wallpaper, same overhead lighting. But it led somewhere that couldn't possibly exist given the house's footprint. The hallway terminated in what appeared to be another staircase, though the angle was wrong, the perspective skewed in a way that hurt to examine directly. I approached slowly, each step echoing with unusual volume. The new corridor felt longer than it looked, distance stretching with each footfall like a camera pulling back. When I finally reached the end, I found another set of stairs descending into darkness. 24 steps leading down to a familiar landing, where they turned left and continued to what must be another kitchen. I descended carefully, avoiding what would be the 13th step. The kitchen below was identical to the one I'd left. Same white cabinets, same stainless steel sink, same refrigerator humming in the corner. But a figure stood silhouetted against the far wall, back turned to me, head tilted in that listening posture I'd come to recognize. This time I didn't hesitate. I stepped deliberately on the 13th step. Creak. The head turned with that impossible rotation, neck twisting until the face, my face, looked directly at me. Features were visible now in the soft light. My eyes, my nose, my mouth slightly open as if about to speak. But the expression was wrong, too calm, too knowing, like looking at a photograph of yourself taken by someone else while you weren't paying attention. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, though I wasn't sure which of us I was addressing. The other me smiled, not with humor, but with recognition, as if I'd finally understood a joke that had been playing out for days. It raised one hand in a small wave, the gesture disturbingly familiar, because I'd seen it in mirrors my entire life. I blinked, and the kitchen was empty again. But when I turned to leave, I found the stairs had changed. Instead of 24 steps leading up, there were now 25, including a new 13th step that creaked as I climbed. Above, the hallway extended in 3 directions instead of 2, each corridor identical, each terminating in another set of stairs that descended to another kitchen, where another version of myself waited with infinite patience. I tried to map the new layout, but the house had become a maze of recursive architecture, each path leading back to the same creaking step, the same patient figure, the same impossible rotation of my own head. The footsteps I heard climbing behind me were my own, chasing myself through a structure that expanded with each descent, contracted with each ascent, breathing in rhythms that matched my heartbeat. Sometimes I encountered myself coming up the stairs as I descended, and we would pass without acknowledgement, like strangers in a crowd. Other times I would reach the kitchen to find multiple silhouettes standing at various angles, all turning their heads in unison when the 13th step announced my arrival. The grandfather clock chimed constantly now, every hour, every half hour, sometimes every few minutes, though the times it announced bore no relationship to the position of its hands. Day and night had lost meaning in the windowless corridors that led only to more corridors, more stairs, more versions of the same kitchen where variations of myself waited with decreasing patience. I stopped trying to find my original bedroom, stopped counting steps or measuring distances. The house had become infinite, a recursive loop of staircases and kitchens and silhouettes that all wore my face. Each time I climbed toward what should have been home, I found instead another unfamiliar hallway that led to another familiar staircase. But I kept climbing, because somewhere in this expanding maze was my real body, lying asleep in my real bed, dreaming of footsteps that climbed toward him with patient persistence. And somewhere else was the real kitchen, the real 13th step, the real silence that my parents had left behind when they departed for Tasmania. I just had to keep climbing until I found the staircase that led up instead of down, the hallway that ended in a door instead of more stairs, the kitchen that contained no silhouettes except the ones cast by furniture in honest light. The 13th step creaked beneath my feet as I began another ascent, following the sound of my own footsteps climbing somewhere above, always one staircase ahead, always leading me home through a house that had forgotten how to end. Behind me, I heard myself beginning the descent again, stepping carefully to avoid the creaking step, just as I had that first night when thirst had driven me from sleep into this recursive dream of staircases and shadows. The grandfather clock chimed 13 times. I kept climbing. Story 4. The house settled into its evening silence with the peculiar weight of a place that isn't quite home. My cousin's ranch-style dwelling had always felt too spacious for comfort, its long hallways stretching into shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. The 3 of us, Marcus, Pete, and myself, had agreed to house-sit while Danny was in Portland, thinking it would be a week of uninterrupted gaming and takeout. The perfect setup for avoiding responsibility. That illusion shattered at 3:17 Tuesday afternoon when the doorbell rang twice in quick succession, followed by a heavy knock that seemed to reverberate through more than just the wooden door. Marcus paused his game, controller frozen mid-combo. "You expecting someone?" I wasn't. Danny hadn't mentioned any service appointments, and the isolation of the house, nestled between overgrown lots on the outskirts of town, meant unexpected visitors were rare. Through the peephole, I observed 2 men in matching gray uniforms standing with unnatural stillness. Their posture suggested official business, but something in their positioning felt rehearsed, like actors who'd memorized their blocking but not the emotion behind it. The taller one spoke when I cracked the door, his voice carrying an odd resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. He introduced himself and his companion as municipal technicians, here to inspect what he called ethereal pressure fluctuations in the water main. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, dissipating slowly while leaving an acrid aftertaste of wrongness. Pete wandered over, drawn by curiosity and the need to stretch after hours hunched over his laptop. His programmer's mind immediately latched onto the terminology. Ethereal pressure? That's not standard municipal jargon. The second technician, broader and somehow softer around the edges, produced a clipboard thick with official-looking documents. The papers fluttered slightly despite the absence of any breeze, and I found myself focusing on that movement rather than the words he was speaking about system integrity and pressure readings that needed immediate attention. Their eyes were wrong. Not obviously so. They had the right color, the right shape, the right placement. But they tracked movement with a delay, as if processing visual information through some intermediary system. When they looked directly at us, it felt less like being seen and more like being measured. We declined their entry. The decision felt instinctive, driven by some primal warning system that bypassed rational thought. The tall technician's smile stretched slightly wider than it should have, revealing teeth that seemed perfectly straight, perfectly white, and perfectly uniform in a way that suggested careful construction rather than natural development. They departed without argument, walking with synchronized steps back to their unmarked van. Through the window, I watched them drive away, but the wrongness they'd brought lingered like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The afternoon dissolved into evening with the artificial acceleration that comes from trying to distract yourself from nagging anxiety. We ordered pizza, played another round of our campaign, and made jokes about municipal workers and their mysterious terminology. But underneath the forced normalcy, something had shifted. The house felt different. Not invaded exactly, but somehow observed. The shadows gathered with more intent, and the familiar sounds of settling wood took on an anticipatory quality. Marcus noticed it first during his trip to the bathroom around 10:30. His voice carried a note of confusion when he called out that the water pressure seemed strange, stronger than usual, but somehow inconsistent. By the time Pete and I joined him, the bathroom faucet was producing a steady stream that looked normal but sounded wrong, less like water moving through pipes, and more like liquid being drawn through something organic. The sound followed us through the house, a subtle gurgling that seemed to originate from within the walls themselves, as if the plumbing had developed a circulatory system. We checked every faucet, every toilet, every connection we could access. The water ran clear and cold, exactly as it should have, but the sound persisted, a wet, rhythmic pulsing that synchronized disturbingly with our own heartbeats. Midnight approached with the inexorable certainty of a tide. We'd retreated to the living room, ostensibly to continue gaming, but our attention kept drifting to the sounds emerging from the kitchen. The main water line ran directly beneath that room, and whatever was moving through it had grown more active as the evening progressed. The kitchen taps activated themselves at 11:58, not all at once, but in sequence. First the main faucet, then the sprayer attachment, finally the filtered water dispenser. Each began with a soft click, followed by the rush of liquid that reflected light in ways that seemed somehow thicker than water should manage. The stream from the main tap carried an oily darkness that swirled without dispersing, creating patterns that suggested movement beyond simple fluid dynamics. Pete approached first, his scientific curiosity overriding his caution. The reflection in the dark water showed his face, but distorted. Features rearranged in subtle ways that transformed the familiar into something unsettling. His eyes appeared wider, positioned slightly too far apart. His mouth curved in an expression he wasn't making. Marcus and I flanked him, drawn by the horrible fascination of seeing ourselves transformed. My own reflection stared back with a smile I could feel wasn't on my face, while Marcus's image seemed to be whispering words that produced no sound. The water continued to flow, but the reflections moved independently, mouthing conversations we couldn't hear and making gestures we weren't performing. The window above the sink provided a view of the backyard, where two figures moved with deliberate purpose through pools of standing water that shouldn't have existed. The ground sloped away from the house, ensuring proper drainage, yet dark puddles had formed in perfect circles across the lawn. The technicians, for they were unmistakably the same men, despite the distance and darkness, walked from circle to circle with steps that never quite contacted the water's surface. Their lips moved in constant, synchronized motion, forming words that carried through the glass despite the impossibility of hearing such quiet sounds from that distance. The rhythm of their speech matched the pulsing in the pipes, and gradually I began to understand that they weren't speaking to each other at all. They were addressing something else, something that responded from within the water system itself. The promises they made were simple and specific: liberation at midnight through the kitchen sink, freedom from the confined spaces of pipes and drains, release into a world of open water and unlimited expansion. As the clock tower downtown began its midnight chime, the water in our sink started to bubble with increasing violence. Not the gentle percolation of carbonation, but a roiling motion that suggested something substantial moving beneath the surface. The reflections grew more distorted, showing versions of ourselves that were fundamentally wrong, faces that wore our features but belonged to something else entirely. The technicians outside raised their voices, their words now clearly audible despite the closed windows and distance. They spoke in a language that might have been English but carried syllables that human mouths shouldn't have been able to produce. The water responded to their calls, rising in the sink despite the open drain, forming shapes that defied both gravity and surface tension. Something was trying to emerge, not swimming up through the water, but using the liquid itself as a medium for manifestation. The dark reflection began to take on depth and substance, transforming from image to presence. Features that had appeared merely rearranged revealed themselves as belonging to entities that had never been human at all. Pete stumbled backward, knocking into Marcus, who grabbed my arm with enough force to leave bruises. We watched in fascinated horror as the water continued to rise, carrying with it the promise of something vast and patient that had been waiting in the spaces between the pipes, in the quiet corners of the municipal system, in the forgotten networks that connected every building to every other building through miles of hidden arteries. The clock finished its 12 chimes, and the water began to recede. Slowly, reluctantly, but definitively. The reflections faded back to normal, showing only our own pale, sweat-dampened faces, staring down at an ordinary kitchen sink running ordinary water. The bubbling stopped. The voices from outside fell silent. When we finally worked up the courage to check the backyard, we found only grass and the normal contours of Danny's landscape. No puddles, no figures, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred beyond our own elevated heart rates and the lingering certainty that we'd witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. But in the morning, when Pete tried to brush his teeth, the bathroom mirror showed his reflection arriving 3 seconds after he'd moved away from it, and Marcus discovered that his voice echoed strangely in the shower, as if the sound was being filtered through something that had learned to imitate human acoustics, but hadn't quite perfected the process. As for myself, I found that I no longer trusted my own reflection. Not because it showed me someone else, but because I'd begun to suspect that the person looking back might be more real than the one casting the image. The water still ran clear and cold from every tap in the house, but it carried with it the persistent sense that something had been introduced into the system. Not a contaminant that could be filtered out, but a presence that had become permanently integrated into the infrastructure itself. Danny returned from Portland 3 days early, citing a business deal that had concluded more quickly than expected. We didn't mention the technicians or the midnight visitation or the continuing strangeness of the water system. How could we explain that his house had become a conduit for something that existed in the spaces between conventional reality? How could we describe the growing certainty that whatever had tried to emerge through his kitchen sink had succeeded in establishing some form of permanent residency? Instead, we packed our things and left with expressions of gratitude for a week well spent. But I noticed that Danny's reflection in the hallway mirror seemed slightly more animated than Danny himself, and when he turned on the kitchen tap to rinse his coffee mug, the water ran just a fraction darker than it should have. I still live in town, 3 miles from my cousin's house, and I've developed the habit of checking my own plumbing with obsessive regularity. The municipal water system connects every building after all, and what inhabits one part of the network might eventually find its way into every other part. Sometimes, late at night when the pressure drops and the pipes sing their quiet songs, I think I can hear voices in the water, promising liberation through any available outlet. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection at just the right angle, I see something that looks back with recognition, as if remembering our brief introduction through a kitchen sink at midnight. It waves with fingers that move independently of my own, and its smile suggests that our acquaintance is far from over. The technicians haven't returned to Danny's house, but that doesn't mean they've stopped working. After all, there are thousands of homes in the municipal system, and something patient enough to inhabit water pipes might very well have all the time in the world to complete its inspections. The ethereal pressure, it seems, requires constant monitoring. Story 5. The demolition notice had been tacked to the front door for 3 weeks, its red letters bleeding in the October rain. Marcus called me that evening, his voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. He couldn't spend another night alone in that place, he said. Not with the sounds, not with what he'd found behind the walls. I drove through the storm to Ashworth Manor, its Victorian silhouette cutting against the bruised sky like a wound. The house had belonged to Marcus's family for generations, but now the city wanted it gone. Something about structural integrity and public safety. Looking at the sagging roof and cracked foundation, I couldn't argue with their assessment. Marcus met me at the door, his face gaunt and eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. The electricity had been cut off days ago, so he handed me a flashlight that cast dancing shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The beam revealed water stains that looked disturbingly like faces, their mouths open in silent screams. "Thanks for coming," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might wake something better left sleeping. "I know this place is a mess, but I needed someone here tonight." The interior reeked of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of old cosmetics. Our footsteps echoed on the warped hardwood as Marcus led me up the grand staircase, its banister sticky beneath my palm. Portraits of long-dead relatives watched us climb, their painted eyes seeming to track our movement in the shifting light. "I've been finding things," Marcus said as we reached the second floor. "Things that shouldn't be here." He guided me to what had once been the master bedroom. Wooden boards covered the far wall, nailed hastily and unevenly. Behind them I could make out the glint of glass. "Mirror," he explained, reading my expression. "There's one behind every board in every bedroom. 7 rooms, 7 mirrors, all facing the beds." My skin prickled. Something about the configuration felt deliberately unsettling, as if the house had been designed to watch its sleeping occupants. Marcus pried away one of the boards with a crowbar, the nails shrieking as they pulled free. The mirror behind was massive, easily 6 feet tall, its silver surface clouded with age. And there she was. In the reflection, standing at the foot of the bed that should have been empty, was a woman. Her face was painted in grotesque parody of joy, white base thick as paste, red lips stretched into an impossible grin, black tears streaming from her eyes. Her hair hung in greasy ringlets, and her dress appeared to be from another era, its once white fabric now yellowed and stained. The rational part of my mind knew it was impossible. I turned to look at the actual room. Nothing there but dust motes dancing in our flashlight beams, but in the mirror, she remained, swaying slightly, as if to music only she could hear. "She's been there since I uncovered the first one 3 nights ago," Marcus whispered. "Sometimes she moves closer. Sometimes she just watches." I stepped toward the mirror, my reflection joining the macabre scene. The woman's painted eyes seemed to focus on me, her crimson smile widening until it threatened to split her face. I reached out to touch the glass, and she raised her own hand in perfect mimicry, her fingernails black and elongated. The moment our reflections would have touched, Marcus grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said urgently. "I tried that once. The glass got so cold it burned my fingers, and I swear I felt..." Pressure, like she was pushing back. We backed away from the mirror, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The woman's reflection didn't follow our movement the way it should have. Instead, she remained fixed in place, her head slowly turning to keep us in view. Marcus produced another board and hammer, quickly covering the mirror again. The moment the glass disappeared from view, we heard it. 3 deliberate knocks from somewhere inside the wall, followed by a sound that made my blood freeze. Laughter, muffled and distorted, but undeniably female, bubbling up from behind the plaster like water from a broken pipe. "Every time," Marcus said, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "Every single time I cover one, she lets me know she's still there." We moved to the next room, where Marcus revealed another mirror. The same woman appeared, though her position had changed. Now she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap like a patient child. Her makeup seemed fresher somehow, the colors more vivid, as if she'd just applied them. Room by room, we toured Marcus's discovery. In each mirror, the painted woman manifested in different poses, standing by the window, lying across the bed, sitting in a corner with her knees drawn up, but always watching, always smiling that terrible smile. By the time we finished our circuit, exhaustion weighed on us like a physical thing. Marcus had set up sleeping bags in the parlor downstairs, far from any mirrors we knew about. We settled in for the night, though sleep seemed as distant as dawn. I lay there listening to the house breathe around us, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through broken shingles, the occasional scurry of some small creature in the walls. But underneath it all was something else, a rhythm that might have been footsteps pacing the floors above us. Marcus's breathing had deepened into the cadence of sleep when I smelled it, that sweet chemical scent growing stronger. It reminded me of grease paint and powder, the backstage atmosphere of old theaters. My eyes watered as the odor intensified, and I sat up to find its source. The parlor mirror, which I hadn't noticed before, hung across from us above the fireplace. In its reflection, our sleeping forms were clearly visible, but there was something wrong with the image. A third figure lay between us, curled on her side with one pale hand resting on Marcus's shoulder. I scrambled for my flashlight, its beam revealing only our 2 sleeping bags with empty space between them. But the mirror told a different story. The woman was there, her makeup smeared now as if she'd been crying, her white dress spread around her like spilled milk. She turned to look at me through the glass, and her mouth opened in what might have been words, or might have been another laugh. I shook Marcus awake, pointing at the mirror. He looked where I indicated, then back at me with confusion. "I don't see anything," he said. "Just us." But I could see her clearly, watching us with those black-rimmed eyes. She raised one finger to her lips in a gesture of silence, then began to mouth words I couldn't understand. Her hands moved in deliberate patterns, as if she were painting invisible pictures in the air. "Marcus," I whispered urgently, "look again. She's right there, between us." He followed my gaze once more, studying the mirror intently. For a moment, his expression remained blank. Then his face went rigid with fear. "Oh God," he breathed. She's moving." In the reflection, the woman had begun to sit up, her movements fluid and wrong, like a marionette operated by a drunk puppeteer. She turned her head toward Marcus with a series of small, jerky motions, and her smile stretched even wider. We both lurched away from the mirror, but the damage was done. The sweet smell had grown overwhelming, coating the inside of my mouth with its cloying residue. And worse than the smell was the sensation of presence, the absolute certainty that we were no longer alone in that room. The temperature dropped noticeably, our breath beginning to fog in the suddenly frigid air. Frost formed on the windows despite the autumn warmth outside. And from somewhere in the house came the sound of movement, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor above us. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the ceiling, as if the beam could penetrate the plaster and reveal what walked there. The footsteps paused directly overhead, then continued in a path that would take them toward the stairs. "We need to leave," I said, already reaching for my jacket. But Marcus shook his head. Where would we go? She's in every mirror now. I've seen her in car windows, storefronts, any reflective surface. Running won't help. The footsteps had reached the top of the stairs. We could hear each board creak under invisible weight as something began its descent. But when I looked at the staircase, nothing was there. Only in the mirror could I see her, the painted woman, now walking down the steps with that same jerky, unnatural gait. She reached the bottom and turned toward the parlor, her movement visible only in reflection. Marcus saw her too now, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and fascination. She approached our mirror slowly, her hands extended as if feeling her way through darkness. When she reached the glass, she pressed her palms against it from the other side. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and I swear I felt the glass bulge outward toward us. Her smile had become something predatory, hungry, and her painted tears had begun to run in fresh streaks down her chalk-white cheeks. That's when I noticed our own reflections beginning to change. My face in the mirror appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, while Marcus's features twisted into an expression I didn't recognize. The reflected versions of ourselves smiled those same terrible grins, their eyes black as tar. "Marcus," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the mirror. "Look at yourself." He did, and his scream caught in his throat. His reflection was moving independently now, mimicking the woman's jerky motions, painting invisible pictures in the air with fingers that ended in black claws. The sweet smell had become unbearable, and I realized what it was. Not just makeup, but the particular blend of cosmetics used by morticians, the chemicals that preserve the dead for display. The woman in the mirror wasn't wearing grease paint. She was wearing death. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment I was transfixed by the horror in the glass. The next I was stumbling through the front door into the storm. Marcus followed, both of us gasping in the clean night air like drowning men breaking the surface. We stood in the rain, staring back at the house. In every window that still held glass I could see her, dozens of reflections of the same painted face, all watching us from different angles. She raised one hand and waved, a grotesque parody of farewell. Dawn came eventually, pale and gray through the storm clouds. When the sun finally broke through, the reflections disappeared. The house looked ordinary again, just another old building scheduled for demolition. Marcus called the city that morning, asking them to expedite the destruction. They were happy to oblige. Apparently, there had been complaints about the property for years. Neighbors reported strange sounds at night, odd reflections in their windows, the persistent smell of chemicals drifting on the wind. The demolition crew arrived within the week. I watched from a safe distance as they brought down Ashworth Manor, room by room, wall by wall. When they reached the second-floor bedrooms, several of the workers commented on the mirrors they found. 7 massive antique pieces, all facing the beds. The mirrors were intact despite decades of neglect, their silver surfaces bright as new. The foreman decided to save them, thinking they might be valuable antiques. They loaded all 7 into a truck bound for an estate sale downtown. That night, I woke to the sound of 3 knocks on my bedroom wall. In my mirror across the room, a familiar figure stood at the foot of my bed, her painted smile wider than ever. She raised one finger to her lips, then began to laugh, that same muffled bubbling sound I'd heard in Ashworth Manor. I don't sleep in that room anymore. I've covered every mirror in my house with sheets and boards, but still I hear her sometimes, walking through the walls, leaving the sweet smell of chemicals in her wake. And sometimes, in windows and puddles and the polished surfaces of appliances, I catch glimpses of that horrible white face. Marcus has disappeared. His apartment is empty, his phone disconnected. But yesterday I saw him in a store window downtown, standing next to the painted woman, both of them smiling at me with black-rimmed eyes. His face bore the same chalk-white makeup now, the same impossible grin. The estate sale is this weekend. 7 antique mirrors, each one perfect for a bedroom. The advertisement promises they'll bring sweet dreams to their new owners. I wonder how many homes they'll visit, how many bedrooms they'll watch over, how many people will wake to the smell of old makeup and the sound of 3 knocks in the wall. I wonder if I should warn someone, or if that would only make me sound crazy. After all, who would believe such a story? Who would accept that some reflections exist independent of reality, that some images persist long after their subjects have gone? Sometimes I think I imagined it all, that the stress of Marcus's situation and the atmosphere of that decaying house simply overwhelmed my rational mind. But then I catch my reflection in an unexpected surface, and I see how my own smile has begun to stretch just a little too wide, how my eyes have started to rim themselves with dark circles that weren't there before. The painted woman found her way out of Ashworth Manor, spreading from mirror to mirror like a virus of reflection. And I think she's still spreading, still watching, still waiting for the perfect moment to step through the glass and join us in this world. After all, everyone needs to see themselves sometime. Everyone needs mirrors, and she'll be waiting when they do. Story 6. The fluorescent lights in my fifth-floor apartment hummed their familiar tune as I bent over spreadsheets that seemed to multiply like cancer cells across my monitor. Numbers blurred together in the harsh white glow, and I rubbed my eyes, feeling the familiar burn of exhaustion. The city stretched below my window, a constellation of distant lives going about their evening routines, unaware of the peculiar isolation that had settled over my building like a thick blanket. It was exactly 10 p.m. when the intercom crackled to life. Static filled the small speaker beside my door, the kind of white noise that makes your teeth itch. But underneath that electronic snow, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A voice, gravelly, familiar, impossibly calm, emerged from the chaos. "Evening, Mr. Patterson. Could you buzz me up? Need to unlock the main door for the night shift." My hand hovered over the release button as recognition hit me like a physical blow. Frank Gutierrez, the building's night janitor who'd worked here for 15 years before his heart gave out in the basement utility room, exactly 31 days ago. I'd been one of the pallbearers at his funeral. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but my finger pressed the button anyway, muscle memory overriding logic. The familiar buzz echoed through the intercom, followed by the distant click of the main door unlocking 5 floors below. I stood frozen in my doorway, listening to the mechanical grinding of the elevator as it began its ascent. The LED display above the doors at the end of my hallway showed its progress. First floor, second, third. My palms began to sweat. Fourth floor, the grinding stopped. Fifth floor, the elevator doors slid open with their usual pneumatic wheeze, revealing an empty car. The interior light flickered once, twice, then settled into its normal steady glow. But something was wrong with the shadows inside. They seemed deeper than they should be, pooling in corners where the light couldn't quite reach. One by one, the hallway lights began to fail. It started at the far end, near the emergency exit. The first fluorescent tube flickered and died with an audible pop, plunging that section into darkness. Then the next one, closer to the elevator. Then the next. The darkness crept toward me like a living thing, swallowing the familiar beige carpet and the numbered doors of my neighbors' apartments. I backed into my apartment and slammed the door, throwing both deadbolts with shaking hands. The metal felt cold against my palms, colder than it should have been. Outside, the final hallway light died, and I was left listening to my own ragged breathing in the sudden silence. That's when the doorbell started. Not the gentle chime I was used to, but a frantic, desperate hammering of the button. Ring, 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 over and over, as if someone was leaning against it with their full weight. I pressed my eye to the peephole and saw nothing but darkness. No shadow beneath the door, no movement in the hallway beyond. Just that invasive cold seeping through the door frame like water through a cracked dam. The ringing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I waited, counting my heartbeats, feeling sweat trickle down my spine despite the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Minutes passed, then hours. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been some kind of electrical malfunction, a power surge that had affected the intercom system and the hallway lights simultaneously. Buildings this old were full of quirks and glitches. But the next night, at exactly 10 p.m., the intercom crackled again. This time the voice was different. Softer, with a slight southern accent that made my chest tighten with recognition. "Honey? It's Mom. I'm downstairs, but I can't seem to get in. Could you help me out?" My mother had been dead for 3 years. Lung cancer, quick and merciless. She'd never visited this building, never even seen my apartment. Yet there was her voice, filtered through static and distance, asking me to let her in with the same patient tone she'd used when I was a child locked out of the house. This time, I didn't press the button. I stood there, paralyzed, as the voice repeated its request. The pleas became more insistent, tinged with a confusion that twisted my stomach into knots. When I finally found the strength to move, I unplugged the intercom entirely, watching the small red light fade to black. But the voices didn't stop. They began coming through the walls themselves, muffled conversations that seemed to originate from the apartments around me. Familiar voices having conversations that made no sense. My college roommate discussing grocery lists with someone who responded in my ex-wife's clipped consonants. My father, who'd never met my brother-in-law, debating baseball statistics with an enthusiasm that would have been charming if it weren't impossible. I started keeping detailed notes, trying to find patterns in the madness. The voices always started at 10 p.m. They always seemed to be coming from just outside my immediate perception, through walls, through floors, through the thin barrier between my apartment and the world beyond. When I pressed my ear to the wall to listen more carefully, they would fade away, leaving only the building's normal creaks and sighs. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. The voices followed me into my dreams, weaving themselves into conversations with people I knew were gone, places I'd never been. I would wake to find myself standing at my door, hand resting on the deadbolt, though I had no memory of getting up. The metal was always ice cold beneath my palm, as if something on the other side was drawing all the heat from it. Dr. Martinez prescribed sleeping pills, then anti-anxiety medication when I tried to explain about the voices. She spoke in careful, measured tones about stress and isolation, about how the mind could play tricks when pushed beyond its limits. I nodded and took the prescriptions, but I stopped taking the pills after the first week. They made the voices louder, more insistent, as if the chemical fog in my brain was somehow amplifying their signal. The building's other residents began to avoid me. Mrs. Chen from 5B started taking the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator when I was around. The young couple in 5D would duck back into their apartment if they heard my door opening. I caught fragments of their whispered conversations in the hallway, words like disturbed and police and eviction, but they couldn't hear the voices. That much became clear when I tried to ask Mrs. Chen about the strange sounds in the building. She'd looked at me with the kind of pitying confusion reserved for the clearly unhinged, shaking her head and muttering something in Mandarin as she hurried away. I was alone with whatever was happening to me. The breaking point came on a Thursday night, exactly 6 weeks after Frank's voice had first crackled through the intercom. I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at a bowl of soup that had gone cold hours ago, when I heard the key in the lock. Not a knock, not the doorbell. The actual sound of metal sliding into metal, tumblers clicking into place. My front door had 2 deadbolts and a chain. I always kept them locked. But I heard the unmistakable sound of my own door opening, the specific creak of the hinges that I'd been meaning to oil for months. Footsteps in my entryway, slow, deliberate, familiar. The soft scuff of Frank's work boots against my hardwood floor. I could smell industrial cleaning solution and the faint mustiness of basement air. "Mr. Patterson?" Frank's voice, no longer filtered through static, called from my living room. "Sorry to bother you so late. Just need to check something real quick." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The soup spoon felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my hand. The footsteps moved through my apartment with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to be conducting his nightly rounds. "Thermostat's been acting up," Frank continued, his voice growing closer. "Building management wants me to take a look at all the units. Won't take but a minute." The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen. I could feel a presence there, patient and expectant, waiting for me to acknowledge it. But when I finally found the courage to turn my head, the doorway was empty. Just shadows and the faint scent of industrial cleaning solution hanging in the air. I spent the rest of the night crammed into the corner of my bedroom closet, surrounded by hanging clothes that felt like a protective barrier between me and whatever was sharing my space. Every sound made me jump. The refrigerator cycling on, the building settling, the distant hum of traffic from the street below. When dawn finally crept through my bedroom blinds, I emerged from the closet to find my apartment exactly as I'd left it. Deadbolts still thrown, chains still latched, no sign that anyone had been inside except for the lingering smell of cleaning solution and a single wet footprint on my kitchen floor, size 11 work boot, just like Frank used to wear. That morning, I called in sick to work and spent hours researching the building's history. What I found in the city records made my hands shake as I scrolled through decades of documents. The building had been constructed in 1987 on the site of an older apartment complex that had burned down the year before. 7 people had died in that fire, trapped on the upper floors when the stairwells filled with smoke. But it was the list of employees who'd worked in the building over the years that made my blood run cold. Frank Gutierrez wasn't the first janitor to die here. 3 others had passed away while employed by the building management company. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents in the basement utility areas. Their names appeared in death notices I found buried in local newspaper archives. Men who'd spent their final years walking these same hallways, maintaining these same systems. The voices weren't just random fragments of my imagination. They were messages, communications from people who'd found themselves trapped between worlds, unable to leave the place where they'd spent so much of their lives. And somehow my apartment had become a kind of focal point, a place where the barrier between the living and the dead had worn thin. But that realization brought with it an even more terrifying possibility. If the building was somehow collecting the voices of the dead, what did that mean for me? I'd been living here for 4 years, working late into the night, building my own patterns of routine and familiarity. Was I already becoming part of whatever force was at work in these walls? The question haunted me through the day, and as 10 p.m. approached, I found myself standing before my front door, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling around me. The voices would come again tonight. They always did. But this time I thought I was beginning to understand what they wanted. They weren't trying to get in. They were trying to get me to come out. The intercom crackled to life exactly on schedule, but tonight there was no static, no distortion. The voice that emerged was clear and calm, tinged with a sadness that made my throat tight. "Mr. Patterson, it's Frank. I know you can hear me. I know you've been listening all these weeks. We've been trying to explain, but you haven't been ready to understand. The building remembers us, son. All of us. And now it's remembering you too." I pressed my forehead against the door, feeling the cold seep through the metal. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing you're not already giving. The building takes care of its own, Mr. Patterson. Always has, always will. But you have to stop fighting it. Stop trying to leave. This is where you belong now. This is where you've always belonged." My hand moved toward the deadbolt without my conscious permission. The metal was so cold it burned against my palm, but I couldn't seem to let go. Behind me, my apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls closer together, the ceiling lower. The familiar space was becoming a cage, but the alternative, whatever waited beyond my door, felt like something far worse. "Just open the door, son. Let us show you how peaceful it can be. How quiet. No more stress, no more deadlines, no more wondering if you're losing your mind. Just the work, just the routine, just the endless, comforting night." As I stood there, frozen between choices that felt equally impossible, I realized that the most terrifying thing wasn't the voices or the cold or the footsteps in my apartment. It was the growing certainty that Frank was right, that I'd been fighting against something inevitable, something that had been calling to me long before his voice had first crackled through the intercom. The building was patient. It could wait as long as necessary. And deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I was beginning to think that maybe waiting was just another form of surrender. My hand remained on the deadbolt, cold metal against warm flesh, as the voices outside my door began to multiply. Frank's gravelly tones joined by others I didn't recognize, then by voices I did. My mother, my father, my college roommate. All of them patient, all of them understanding, all of them inviting me to step outside and join the endless routine of the night shift. I closed my eyes and listened to their gentle persuasion, feeling the building settle around me like a living thing, feeling my own resistance begin to crumble like old mortar. The deadbolt turned so easily under my palm, just a simple twist of the wrist. And in that moment, I couldn't remember why I'd ever wanted to keep it locked. Story 7. The first thing I noticed about the Millbrook district wasn't the broken streetlights or the boarded windows. It was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of suburbia, but something heavier, like the air itself had given up. The realtor had called it transitional, which I learned was code for the only place you can afford on your salary. 3 months after the divorce, with my credit shot and my savings drained, transitional was all I could manage. The house squatted between two vacant lots like a rotting tooth, its vinyl siding the color of old bone. Inside, the previous tenant had left behind the smell of cigarettes and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of overripe fruit. I told myself it would fade once I opened the windows and let some air circulate. That first week, I threw myself into making the place livable, scrubbing floors, patching holes, replacing the ancient fixtures that flickered and hummed like dying insects. The work kept my hands busy and my mind off Sarah, off the empty apartment she'd taken half our furniture from, off the way she'd looked at me those last few months like I was something she'd stepped in. The living room faced west, its single large window offering a view of the street through glass so old it warped everything into funhouse distortions. During the day, I could watch the occasional car crawl past, their occupants hunched over steering wheels like they were fleeing something. But it was the evenings that held my attention. The streetlight across from my window had seen better decades. Its sodium glow cast everything in sickly yellow, creating a pool of light that seemed to push the darkness back rather than illuminate anything useful. Trees lined the sidewalk, massive oaks that had grown wild and untended, their branches creating a canopy so thick that daylight struggled to reach the ground even at noon. It was on my 8th day that I first heard the knocking. 3 knocks. Soft, deliberate, against the living room window. Tap, tap, tap. I'd been unpacking boxes, working by the dim light of a single lamp, when the sound cut through the evening quiet. My first thought was neighborhood kids, though I hadn't seen any since moving in. When I looked up from my books, the window showed only that pool of yellow light and the empty sidewalk beyond. The knocking came again the next evening. Same pattern, same gentle persistence. This time I was ready. I killed the lamp and crept to the window, pressing my face against the cool glass. The street lay empty, bathed in that jaundiced glow. No one stood on the sidewalk. No branches hung close enough to tap against the glass in the still air. By the 3rd evening, I had my phone ready, camera app open. The knocking began exactly at sunset. I'd started checking the time. Tap, tap, tap. I hit record, holding the phone steady as I filmed the empty street beyond the glass. Later, watching the footage on my laptop, I felt my stomach clench. The audio was clear, 3 distinct knocks, exactly as I'd heard them. But the video showed no hands, no figure standing at my window. Instead, projected onto the asphalt in the streetlight's glow, 3 elongated shadows stretched across the ground. They appeared at the moment of each knock, dark shapes that seemed to originate from something standing just outside the camera's frame, something that should have been visible through the window but wasn't. I replayed the footage until my eyes burned. The shadows were there, undeniable, long and thin, like fingers reaching across the pavement. With each passing day, as I continued recording, they grew shorter and more defined. Whatever was casting them was moving closer to my window. The realization hit me like ice water. Something was approaching my house every evening, standing just outside my field of vision, and knocking on my window. Something I couldn't see but that cast shadows in the streetlight. I called a locksmith the next morning, but his van broke down before he reached my street. The hardware store recommended a local carpenter named Miguel Restrepo. When I explained I needed security bars for my windows, his voice grew cautious over the phone. "You sure you want bars on that place?" he asked. "Sometimes it's better to have a way out." But I insisted, and he agreed to come by the following Tuesday. Miguel arrived in a dented pickup truck loaded with metal bars and tools that looked older than the house. He was a compact man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. When he saw the window in question, he paused, running his palm along the frame. "How long you been living here?" he asked, not looking at me. 2 weeks. He nodded, still examining the window. "This glass is original, probably 60, 70 years old. You notice anything unusual about the place?" The question caught me off guard. "Like what?" Miguel straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just asking. Some houses, they hold on to things. Memories, sometimes more than memories." As he worked, measuring and marking drill points, I noticed him glancing frequently at the window itself, not the frame. His movements grew more hurried as the afternoon wore on, and when sunset approached, he packed his tools with nervous efficiency. "I'll come back tomorrow to finish," he said, loading his truck bed. "But listen, you might want to seal that window frame. Sometimes the old ones, they get gaps. Things can get through gaps." "What kind of things?" But Miguel was already climbing into his truck. "I'll bring more materials tomorrow," he called through the window, and drove away with an urgency that left me standing alone on my front porch as the first shadows of evening crept across the yard. The next morning I found a canvas bag hanging from my gate. No note, no explanation. Inside, a collection of bent nails, each one twisted into an unnatural spiral. As I lifted the bag, the nails seemed to shift and writhe against each other, though I knew it had to be the movement of my hands causing the effect. Miguel never returned. I called his number repeatedly over the next few days, but got only voicemail. When I drove to the address he'd given me, I found an empty lot overgrown with weeds. The hardware store clerk claimed they'd never heard of any Miguel Restrepo. The nails remained on my kitchen counter, and I swear they moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. Just subtle shifts, a gradual migration across the formica surface. I'd leave them in one position and return to find them arranged differently, forming patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. The knocking continued every evening, punctual as a heartbeat. My recordings showed the shadows growing shorter and more distinct. By the end of the second week, they stretched only halfway across the street. Whatever was casting them had moved significantly closer. I stopped sleeping well. Every creak of the house settling, every whisper of wind through the oak branches, sent adrenaline coursing through my system. During the day, I found myself checking and rechecking the locks, testing the windows, examining the frames for the gaps Miguel had mentioned. The house began to feel different, smaller somehow, as if the walls were gradually contracting. The sweet smell I'd noticed when I first moved in grew stronger, concentrated near the living room window. When I cleaned the glass, the odor intensified, and I noticed something that made my hands shake. The inside surface of the window was warm to the touch, even on cool mornings when no sunlight reached it. I started researching the house's history at the local library, a cramped building that smelled of old paper and resignation. The librarian, a woman whose name tag read Dorothy, helped me navigate the microfilm archives with the weary patience of someone who'd answered too many questions about things better left alone. The records were frustratingly incomplete. The house had changed hands frequently over the decades, never staying with one family for more than a year or two. Most of the previous residents had simply left. No forwarding addresses, no explanations. Just empty houses and unpaid utility bills. One newspaper clipping caught my attention, a brief mention of a missing person report from 1987. A carpenter named Richard Voss had disappeared while working on renovations in the Millbrook district. His tools were found scattered in the street, and neighbors reported strange sounds coming from the house where he'd been working, my house. The investigation was closed after 2 weeks with no leads. I drove home that evening with my hands trembling on the steering wheel, Dorothy's parting words echoing in my mind. Some folks say that neighborhood remembers things, holds on to them. You might want to consider finding somewhere else to live. But I couldn't leave. Where would I go? My savings were exhausted, my credit worthless. This house, whatever was wrong with it, was all I had. That night the knocking came earlier, just as the sun touched the horizon. Tap, tap, tap. I watched from across the room as the shadows appeared in the street, shorter now, more defined. They looked almost like fingers pressed against glass, searching for a way in. I'd grown obsessed with the patterns they made, the way they seemed to reach toward my window with increasing urgency. In my recordings, I could see that they'd moved from the far side of the street to the near curb, then to the sidewalk. Last night, they'd stretched across my front yard. Tonight, they began at the edge of my porch. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever was out there, it was almost at my window. The shadows reached from just below the glass to somewhere near the street. But their source, the thing casting them, had to be standing immediately outside, possibly touching the window itself. I forced myself to approach, my phone's camera recording everything. The glass felt fever-hot against my palm, and the sweet smell was so strong it made my head swim. In the reflection I could see my own face, pale and drawn, but behind me. I spun around, heart hammering. The living room was empty, but on my phone screen, saved in the video file, I could see what my reflection had shown. A second face, barely visible in the glass. Gaunt features, hollow eyes, and an expression of such desperate hunger, it made my throat close with fear. But when I looked at the window directly, I saw only my own terrified reflection and the empty street beyond. The knocking began again, more insistent now. Tap, tap, tap. The shadows on the pavement pointed directly at my feet, sharp and dark as knife blades. I stumbled backward, my phone clattering to the floor. The nails Miguel had left were moving freely now, no longer requiring me to look away. They writhed across the counter like living things, forming spirals and patterns that seemed to pull at my vision, drawing my eyes into their centers until the room spun around me. I grabbed the bag and stumbled toward the living room, some instinct driving me forward. The knocking had become frantic, no longer the measured 3-tap pattern, but a continuous rattling against the glass. The shadows in the street jerked and twisted like fingers scrabbling for purchase. With shaking hands, I spilled the nails onto the windowsill. They immediately began arranging themselves, spiraling outward from a central point, their bent shapes interlocking in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The rattling at the window grew louder, more desperate, but the nails continued their work, forming intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. Gradually, the knocking stopped. The shadows in the street began to fade, retreating toward the far sidewalk as if something was pulling their source away from my house. The nails went still, their spiraled pattern now permanent along the windowsill. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching the empty street, waiting for the sounds to return. But the night remained quiet except for my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the failing streetlight. Days passed without incident. No knocking, no shadows, no movement from the nails. I began to wonder if it had all been stress, isolation, the aftermath of my divorce playing tricks with my perception. The mind, I told myself, was capable of elaborate self-deception when pushed too far. But I didn't remove the nails from the windowsill, and I started noticing other things. The way delivery drivers avoided looking at my house. How the mailman left packages at the curb rather than approaching the door. The strange looks from neighbors when I ventured out, as if they could smell something on me, something that marked me as different. The sweet smell in the house had faded but never completely disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, I caught whiffs of it drifting from the walls themselves, as if the house were slowly exhaling whatever it had absorbed over the decades. I kept the recordings on my phone, reviewing them obsessively. The shadows were there, undeniable, documented, but with each viewing, they seemed slightly different, as if the digital files themselves were changing. The face in the reflection grew clearer in some versions, more obscure in others. Sometimes it appeared to be watching me directly, eyes focused on something beyond the camera's perspective. The local library became my refuge. Dorothy greeted me with knowing sympathy when I arrived each morning, but she never asked questions. I researched everything I could find about the Millbrook district, about houses that held on to things, about carpenter disappearances and unexplained phenomena. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that my house sat at the center of something larger, some gravitational pull that drew in the desperate and the lost. Residents vanished or fled, workers disappeared, but the house remained, patient and hungry. Yet I couldn't leave. Every time I considered packing, every time I looked at apartments I couldn't afford, or called friends who'd stopped returning my messages, I found myself back at that living room window, staring out at the empty street. The nails on the sill had kept whatever was out there at bay, but they'd also created a kind of prison. I was safe inside, but the safety came with a price. The growing certainty that I was no longer entirely alone in the house. The presence I felt watching me wasn't malevolent exactly, more like lonely, desperate for connection, for acknowledgement. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that didn't match any object in the room. At night, I heard footsteps in the empty spaces between the walls, soft sounds like someone pacing in rooms that didn't exist. I started talking to it, to them, to whatever lingered in the corners of my new home. Short conversations at first, just acknowledgments of their presence. The footsteps would pause when I spoke, as if listening. Gradually, I found myself sharing more. My fears about the future, my regrets about the marriage, my growing isolation from the world outside. The house listened, and slowly, I began to understand that I wasn't its victim. I was its newest collaborator, the latest in a long line of residents who discovered that some prisons were more comfortable than the alternatives they replaced. Miguel's twisted nails still guard my window, keeping the shadows at bay. But as I write this, months after that first evening's knocking, I realize they serve a double purpose. They don't just keep things out. Sometimes, late at night when the streetlight flickers and the shadows dance differently on my walls, I wonder if they're also designed to keep things in. The knocking hasn't returned, but I find myself missing it. At least then I knew something wanted to reach me. Now, as autumn settles over the Millbrook district and my neighbors continue their careful avoidance, I understand that isolation comes in many forms. I could leave, pack my few belongings, abandon the lease, find some other transitional situation in some other forgotten corner of the city. But the house has taught me something valuable. Sometimes the things we fear most are simply looking for the same thing we are. A place to belong. The nails on my windowsill catch the morning light now, their spiraled shapes casting intricate shadows on my floor. Different shadows, but shadows nonetheless. And sometimes when the light hits them just right, I swear I can see faces in those patterns. Not the gaunt, hungry expression from my window's reflection, but something gentler, more patient, more grateful. I've stopped questioning what's real and what isn't. In a house that holds on to memories, in a neighborhood that remembers everything, the distinction seems less important than the simple act of witness, of acknowledgement, of choosing to stay. After all, we're all just shadows cast by something larger than ourselves, reaching toward whatever light we can find. And if that light happens to shine through windows guarded by twisted nails in a house where carpenters disappear and the walls breathe slowly in the night, well, at least we're reaching together. Story 8. Boy, the house had always felt too quiet, but that Tuesday afternoon, the silence carried weight, like the air before a storm, pressing against my eardrums with an almost physical presence. I'd been house-sitting for my parents for 3 weeks now, and the familiar rooms had begun to feel foreign, their shadows shifting in ways that made me question whether I'd always lived among strangers. I was adjusting the living room blinds when Marcus's voice cut through the afternoon stillness, sharp and urgent. "David! David!" The sound came from somewhere beyond the front yard, but when I peered through the slats, I could see him standing near the mailbox, mouth moving in animated conversation. Only his lips didn't match the voice calling my name. They moved in different rhythms, forming words I couldn't decipher, while that familiar shout seemed to originate not from his throat, but from somewhere deep inside my own chest cavity. My hands trembled as I adjusted the blinds for a better view. Marcus stood motionless now, his face turned toward the house with an expression I couldn't quite read from this distance. The afternoon sun cast his shadow long across the driveway, but something about the angle seemed wrong, as if the light were coming from multiple directions at once. That's when I saw it in the window glass. His reflection, standing directly behind me in the living room, close enough that I should have felt his breath on my neck. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but found only empty space and the faint scent of something metallic in the air. When I turned back to the window, Marcus was gone. The driveway stretched empty beneath the relentless sun, heat waves rising from the asphalt like transparent flames. The first beer bottle shattered in the backyard an hour later. I was in the kitchen, mechanically preparing a sandwich I had no appetite for, when the sound reached me, a violent explosion of glass against concrete. But the sound arrived muffled, dampened, as if I were hearing it from underwater or through layers of cotton. It held none of the sharp clarity that should accompany breaking glass. Instead, it felt soft around the edges, almost gentle. Through the kitchen window, I could see the scattered remains of a brown bottle near the patio chairs. No wind stirred the afternoon air. No birds flew overhead. No explanation presented itself for how the bottle had found its way from the recycling bin to its current shattered state. I left it there. Something about the broken glass unnerved me in ways I couldn't articulate, as if cleaning it up might disturb some delicate balance I didn't understand. The next morning brought the first incident with the water glass. I'd filled it from the kitchen tap, the clear liquid catching sunlight streaming through the breakfast nook window. But the moment the rim touched my lips, I felt the glass fracture beneath my fingers. Not violently, not with any sound, but with the quiet inevitability of ice forming on a winter pond. Hair-thin cracks spread across the surface in perfect silence, creating a web of damage that should have caused the glass to collapse entirely. It didn't. The glass held together, defying physics, while cold water trickled between the fissures and down my chin. I set it on the counter with exaggerated care, watching droplets weep from the fractured surface onto the granite. For the rest of that morning, I avoided anything made of glass, but Marcus's voice had other plans. It started as a whisper from the back hallway around noon. My name spoken so softly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. The house stretched empty around me, confirmed by my thorough search of every room, every closet, every possible hiding place, yet the voice persisted, growing clearer as the afternoon wore on, always seeming to originate from whichever room I wasn't currently occupying. David. Patient. Insistent. Impossible. By evening, I found myself responding to the silence between the calls, straining to hear something that might explain the impossible. The house's familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of old wood, the distant whisper of traffic, all seemed suddenly alien, as if I were listening to a recording of a place I'd never actually lived. I tried calling Marcus. His phone went straight to voicemail, his recorded voice sounding nothing like the one that had been calling my name. The difference struck me as significant, though I couldn't explain why. The wine glass cracked during dinner preparation the following day. This time I watched it happen. Watched the crystal stemware develop a perfect spiral fracture the instant it touched my lower lip, the crack traveling with impossible slowness around the bowl's circumference. The Merlot inside remained contained despite the visible damage. Dark liquid pressing against compromised glass that somehow maintained its structural integrity. I found myself wondering if this was how madness began, not with dramatic breaks from reality, but with small, persistent impossibilities that accumulated like sediment until the weight of them changed everything. That night, I dreamed of Marcus standing in the backyard, speaking words that emerged from my own throat. In the dream, every piece of glass in the house was simultaneously intact and shattered, existing in both states until observed. When I woke, my mouth tasted of metal and broken promises. The coffee mug was porcelain. It should have been safe. But when I raised it to my lips the next morning, hairline fractures appeared across its surface like a roadmap to nowhere. The coffee inside remained hot, contained by ceramic that had somehow learned to fail in silence, without the courtesy of collapse or the drama of destruction. I began to understand that the material didn't matter. Glass, ceramic, even the plastic water bottle I tested later that afternoon, all developed the same quiet fractures the moment they made contact with my lips, as if my touch carried some curse that rendered all containers unreliable, all barriers permeable. Marcus's voice grew stronger, more insistent. It no longer confined itself to distant rooms, but followed me throughout the house, sometimes seeming to come from inside the walls themselves, sometimes from the air directly beside my ear. The tone remained unchanged, urgent, calling, desperate for acknowledgement I couldn't bring myself to provide. I stopped drinking anything for 12 hours, my throat growing parched as I stared at the kitchen faucet with something approaching terror. When thirst finally drove me to cup water in my hands, the liquid tasted of copper and regret, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment of contact. The bathroom mirror cracked while I was brushing my teeth that evening. Not from impact, not from stress, but spontaneously. A single diagonal line that divided my reflection into two slightly misaligned halves. I watched it happen, toothbrush foam dripping from my open mouth as the crack appeared with the same impossible silence that had been following me for days. In the fractured reflection, I looked like a stranger. That's when I began to suspect that the strangeness hadn't begun with Marcus's appearance in the yard. It had been building slowly, invisibly, like pressure behind a dam I hadn't known existed. The broken glass, the fractured containers, the voice that spoke my name in empty rooms, they were symptoms, not causes. But symptoms of what? I found myself retracing the past weeks, looking for the moment when normal had shifted into something else entirely. Had it started when I'd first arrived at my parents' house? Earlier when they'd asked me to house sit while they visited my sister across the country? Or had it been growing inside me for months, waiting for the right conditions to manifest? The answers felt important and irrelevant in equal measure. On the 5th day, I discovered that I could predict the fractures. The moment before glass touched my lips, I could sense the exact pattern the cracks would follow, could map their routes across crystal and ceramic with the precision of a cartographer charting familiar territory. This knowledge brought no comfort, only the growing certainty that I was either losing my mind or discovering something about reality that was never meant to be known. Marcus's voice had evolved too. No longer content with simply calling my name, it had begun offering fragments of conversation that made no sense. The blue car is parked too close to the hydrangeas, or she never returned the book about birds, or the insurance papers are in the 3rd drawer down. These pronouncements carried the weight of urgent information, but information meant for someone else, about situations I didn't recognize. I began to wonder if Marcus was really Marcus at all, or if something else was borrowing his voice to communicate messages I wasn't equipped to understand. The breaking point came with the glass of water I poured Saturday evening. As I raised it toward my lips, watching the familiar fractures begin their silent dance across the surface, Marcus's voice spoke directly into my ear. "Don't drink that." I froze, the damaged glass suspended inches from my mouth, water seeping between the cracks and dripping onto my shoes. The voice had been unmistakably close, unmistakably real, unmistakably concerned. "It's not safe," the voice continued, and this time I was certain it was coming from directly behind me. "None of it has been safe." I set the glass down with infinite care and turned around. The kitchen stretched empty, shadows pooling in corners that had never seemed quite so dark before. But the air held a weight that suggested recent presence, the way a room feels just after someone has left it. "Marcus?" I spoke to the emptiness, my voice sounding small and uncertain. No response came, but something shifted in my peripheral vision. Not movement exactly, but a change in the quality of the shadows near the doorway leading to the hall, as if darkness itself was paying attention. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room, watching the street through windows that reflected nothing but black glass. Every sound, The settling house, distant traffic, the whisper of wind through leaves, seemed amplified and significant, as if the night itself was trying to communicate something just beyond my comprehension. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, definitely human. They approached the living room with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going, someone who belonged in this house as much as I did. But when I looked toward the hallway, no one appeared in the doorway. The footsteps stopped just out of sight, and in the silence that followed, I heard breathing that wasn't my own. Deep, steady respirations that seemed to echo from somewhere inside the walls themselves. "I'm here," Marcus's voice said, so close it might have been spoken directly into my ear. "I've been here the whole time." The truth, when it came, arrived not as revelation but as recognition. The way you might suddenly understand that the face you've been staring at in an old photograph was someone you'd known all along. I had been alone in this house for weeks. The calls to my parents had gone unanswered because they couldn't hear me anymore. The food had been running out because no deliveries had come, because no one knew I was here. The mail had stopped arriving because, from the outside world's perspective, this house had been empty since the day I'd disappeared. Marcus hadn't been calling my name from the yard. Marcus had been calling my name from the world I could no longer reach, trying to find me across a barrier I didn't understand and couldn't cross. The broken glass wasn't breaking. It was showing me the truth about my own fractured existence, the impossibility of my continued presence in a space I no longer belonged to. Every container that cracked at my touch was demonstrating the fundamental incompatibility between what I was and what I was trying to be. I looked down at my hands in the dim light filtering through the windows. They seemed solid enough, casting shadows that appeared real. But when I pressed them against the coffee table, they left no warmth on the surface, no evidence of contact. The voice in the hallway spoke again, closer now. "David, can you hear me? We've been looking for you everywhere." I understood then that Marcus was real, and his concern was real, and his voice was calling to me across a divide that had nothing to do with distance, and everything to do with the nature of existence itself. He was standing in the same space I occupied, but in a version of reality where I was missing, where my parents had returned from their trip to find their house empty, and their son vanished without explanation. The glass had been trying to tell me. Every fracture had been a message about my own broken state, my own impossible persistence in a place where I was no longer meant to be. I stood slowly, understanding that this recognition might be the first step toward resolution, or toward something else entirely. The air around me felt thinner now, as if acknowledgement of my condition was causing the world to lose its grip on me. "I'm here," I said aloud, though I wasn't certain if the words carried sound or if they existed only in the space between realities where I seemed to have taken up residence. Marcus's voice came again, fainter now. "Keep talking. I think I heard something." I walked toward the hallway, toward the sound of breathing that wasn't mine, toward the possibility of crossing back into a world where broken glass stayed broken, and voices came from throats instead of from the hollow spaces between what was real and what was remembered. But with each step, the house around me seemed to grow more transparent, as if my movement toward truth was causing everything else to fade. The walls became suggestions of walls. The floor beneath my feet felt increasingly theoretical, and the darkness ahead promised not reunion, but dissolution. I stopped walking. Behind me, Marcus's voice called my name one more time, desperate and distant. Ahead, the hallway stretched towards something that might have been escape, or might have been ending. I chose to remain where I was, suspended between possibilities, while around me the house held itself together through sheer force of habit, and the broken glass continued its silent testimony to truths too fragile for this world to contain. Story 9. The afternoon silence pressed against my eardrums like water at the bottom of a deep pool. I'd been staring at my chemistry homework for 20 minutes, the equations blurring into meaningless symbols, while the house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Mom wouldn't be home until 6, Dad even later. The empty room stretched behind me, each one holding its breath. That's when I heard the engine, not the smooth purr of our neighbor's sedan or the rattling wheeze of the mail truck, but something deeper, a growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. I looked up from my textbook, pencil still poised over a half-finished molecular diagram, and felt something cold slide down my spine. Through the living room window, I watched a red pickup truck backing into our driveway. The vehicle moved with deliberate slowness, its reverse lights casting pale circles on the concrete. But instead of straightening out, it stopped at an angle, blocking most of the driveway entrance. The engine continued its low rumble for several seconds before cutting off with a decisive click. I waited for the driver's door to open, and waited. The truck sat there like a sleeping animal, its red paint catching the late afternoon sun. I could see through the rear window that someone was behind the wheel, a silhouette wearing what looked like a baseball cap. But they weren't moving, just sitting, watching. My fingers tightened around the pencil until the yellow paint began to crack under my nail. Something about the scene felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. Maybe it was the way the truck had backed in so deliberately, or how the driver seemed in no hurry to get out. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a feeling that crawled up from my gut and settled in my throat like a stone. Minutes passed. The digital clock on the cable box ticked from 3:47 to 3:48, then 3:49. Still, the figure in the truck didn't move. I set down my pencil and crept toward the window, keeping low. From this angle, I could see more of the cab's interior. The driver wore what looked like a camouflaged hunting cap, the kind with ear flaps tied up on top. But something was off about his profile. It took me a moment to realize what it was. His face was wrong. Not wrong in the way that faces sometimes look strange in profile, or wrong because of bad lighting. Wrong because it didn't look like a face at all. It looked like wet clay. Smooth, featureless wet clay that seemed to shift and flow even as I watched. My breath fogged the window glass. I wiped it away with my sleeve, blinking hard, certain I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the clay-faced driver was getting out of the truck. He moved with an odd, stilted gait, like someone learning to walk after a long illness. His clothes were ordinary enough, dark jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots. But the way he wore them seemed off, as if he wasn't quite sure how they were supposed to fit. And that face, if you could call it a face, continued to drip. Thick, reddish-brown drops fell from where his chin should have been, splattering on the concrete with wet smacks that I could hear even through the closed windows. Each drop hit the ground and spread into a perfect circle, like paint dropped in water. But instead of drying, they seemed to sink into the concrete, leaving dark stains that faded even as I watched. The clay-faced figure began walking around our house. Not toward the front door, not toward the porch, but around the perimeter, his boots clicking against the concrete walkway. He moved slowly, deliberately, occasionally stopping to peer into windows or test door handles. I ducked away from the living room window and crawled toward the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs. From there, I could track his progress by the sound of his footsteps. Click, pause, click, pause. Around the side of the house now, past the utility room, approaching the backyard. What was he looking for? I pressed my back against the kitchen cabinets and tried to think. The rational part of my brain, the part that solved chemistry problems and remembered to turn in homework on time, insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was someone from the gas company checking meters. Maybe it was a neighbor I didn't recognize. Maybe the strange clay appearance was just a trick of the light, or exhaustion, or stress from too much studying. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be prey, whispered something different. It whispered that this wasn't normal, wasn't safe, wasn't human. The footsteps stopped directly outside the kitchen window. I held my breath, afraid even the sound of my breathing might give me away. Slowly, carefully, I raised my head until I could peek over the windowsill. The clay-faced figure stood 3 feet away, separated from me only by a pane of glass and a screen. Up close, the wrongness of his appearance was even more pronounced. The clay that served as his face was the color of river mud, wet and glistening. It moved constantly, flowing and reshaping itself like living putty. Sometimes it almost formed features, the suggestion of a nose here, the beginning of a mouth there. But they never quite solidified, before melting back into the smooth, blank surface. More drops fell from his face onto the patio stones below, and as they hit, something extraordinary happened. Tiny green shoots pushed up through the concrete, impossibly fast. In the space of a heartbeat, they grew from nothing to several inches tall, their leaves unfurling with soft rustling sounds. The shoots twisted and curled, reaching toward the clay figure like plants reaching toward sunlight. He didn't seem to notice the growing vegetation. Instead, he pressed his featureless face against the kitchen window and began making a sound, a low, wet humming that vibrated through the glass. His hands, I noticed, were also wrong. The fingers were too long, and like his face, they seemed to be made of the same flowing clay. As he moved them across the window, they left muddy smears on the glass. I bit my knuckle to keep from crying out. The clay-faced figure stepped back from the window and continued his circuit around the house. I listened to his footsteps fade toward the front yard, then scrambled across the kitchen floor to the back door. The plants that had sprouted from his dripped clay were growing with impossible speed. What had been tiny shoots moments before were now thick vines, their tendrils wrapping around the door handle, the mail slot, even reaching up toward the deadbolt. As I watched, one of the larger vines began to turn, applying pressure to the handle as if testing whether the door was locked. I lunged forward and threw the deadbolt, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the metal. The vine immediately stopped moving, but it didn't withdraw. Instead, it seemed to pulse, as if listening. The footsteps returned to the front of the house. I heard the truck's engine start up, that same deep growl that had first caught my attention. Relief flooded through me. He was leaving. Whatever this was, whoever this was, he was giving up and driving away. But as I crept back toward the living room window, something made me pause. The engine sound was wrong. It was getting louder, not softer. And there was something else. A scraping, grinding noise, like metal being dragged across concrete. I peered through the front window and felt the world tilt sideways. The red pickup truck was still in the driveway, engine running, exhaust pipe coughing gray smoke into the cooling air. But the clay-faced figure was no longer in the driver's seat. The cab appeared empty, though the engine continued to rev and idle with mechanical persistence. A new sound reached my ears, the wet slap of clay hitting concrete. I looked toward the sound and saw him standing beside the truck, his featureless face turned toward the house, toward me. But something was different now. The clay was moving more actively, forming and reforming shapes across his head and neck. For a moment, it almost looked like he was trying to speak, the mud pushing outward and pulling back like a mouth struggling to form words. More drops fell from his face, and where they landed, the vegetation grew even more aggressively. Thick vines erupted from the concrete, reaching toward the house with hungry tendrils. Some wrapped around the porch railings, others began climbing the siding. A few of the largest vines had already reached the front windows and were pressing against the glass with soft tapping sounds. The clay figure watched this growth with what might have been satisfaction, though it was impossible to read emotion on that flowing, featureless surface. Then he began walking toward the house again, but this time he moved differently. His stilted gait was gone, replaced by something more fluid, more confident, as if he was getting better at being human. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The front door was solid wood with 2 deadbolts. It would hold. The back door was secured. The windows were all closed and locked. But the vines... I ran to the kitchen and looked out the back window. The vegetation had grown into a thick mat that covered most of the patio. Some of the vines had climbed high enough to reach the second-story windows. As I watched, one particularly thick strand wrapped around the back door handle and began to turn it. The deadbolt held, but I could hear the handle clicking back and forth with increasing urgency. Metal scraped against metal as the vine applied more pressure, testing the lock's strength. From the front of the house came the sound of the truck door slamming. Heavy footsteps approached the front porch, accompanied by that wet, slapping sound of clay hitting concrete. The footsteps stopped at the front door. Silence. Then softly, the sound of keys jingling. My blood turned to ice water. We kept a spare house key hidden in a fake rock near the front steps. Dad's idea in case of emergencies. But how could this thing possibly know about that? The jingling stopped. A key slid into the front door lock with a soft metallic whisper. I grabbed the cordless phone from the kitchen counter and dialed 911, my fingers fumbling over the numbers. The phone rang once, twice. The line went dead. I looked at the phone's display. No signal. But that was impossible. We'd never had signal problems before. The front door lock clicked open. I ran toward the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Behind me, I heard the front door creak open, followed by wet footsteps on the hardwood floor. The clay figure was inside. In my parents' bedroom, I locked the door and pushed a chair against it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the furniture. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what was happening. The footsteps below moved slowly through the house, accompanied by that awful dripping sound. I could track his progress by the wet splashes. Living room, kitchen, hallway. He seemed to be searching for something, though I couldn't imagine what. My phone. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and tried calling 911 again. No signal. I tried calling Mom's work number. Nothing. Dad's cell. Dead air. Below, the footsteps had stopped. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of the truck engine still running outside. Then I heard it, a soft scratching at the bedroom window. I turned and saw vines pressing against the glass, their tendrils finding the edges of the window frame and working their way into the gaps. The plants moved with purpose, not randomly like normal vegetation, but with the focused intent of something intelligent. A piece of clay fell from somewhere above and landed on the windowsill with a wet smack. I looked up and saw more clay seeping through a crack in the ceiling, dripping down like brown rain. He was on the roof. The ceiling began to bulge downward as more weight pressed against it from above. Bits of plaster rained down, and the light fixture swayed ominously. The clay drips became a steady stream, and where they hit the floor, new shoots immediately began to grow. I backed against the far wall, watching in horror as the bedroom filled with increasingly aggressive vegetation. Vines wrapped around the bed frame, the dresser, anything they could reach. Some of the larger strands began growing toward me with unmistakable purpose. The ceiling bulged further. Cracks appeared in the plaster, spreading outward like spiderwebs. I had to get out. I moved the chair away from the door and unlocked it, listening carefully. The footsteps had moved upstairs now. I could hear them in the hallway, approaching slowly. Wet splashes marked his progress. I cracked the door open and peered out. The hallway was dark except for muddy tracks that led from the staircase toward my room. Between the tracks, small plants pushed up through the hardwood floor, their roots somehow finding purchase in the sealed wood. The clay figure appeared at the far end of the hall. Up close, in the dim light, he looked even less human than before. The clay face had developed what might have been eye sockets, dark holes that seemed to go much deeper than they should, and the mouth area had formed into something like a grin, though it was too wide and showed what looked like more clay instead of teeth. He raised one muddy hand toward me, fingers stretching longer than human fingers should stretch, and made that wet humming sound again. This time, though, it almost sounded like words, like he was trying to tell me something. I slammed the door shut and looked around desperately. The window. It was a long drop to the front yard, but there was a roof overhang below. If I could reach it. Behind me, the bedroom door began to rattle as something pressed against it, not knocking, pressing, as if a great weight was leaning against the wood. I ran to the window and struggled with the locks. My sweaty fingers slipped on the metal, but finally the latches gave way. I pushed the window open and felt cool evening air rush in. The vines immediately reached through the opening, wrapping around my wrists and ankles. I pulled free, leaves tearing in my hands, and climbed onto the sill. Below, the red pickup truck still sat in the driveway, engine running. But something was wrong with it now. The truck's surface seemed to ripple and shift, like the clay figure's face. As I watched, the vehicle's shape began to change, becoming less truck-like and more organic. The bedroom door splintered behind me. I jumped. The impact with the roof overhang knocked the wind out of me, but nothing seemed broken. I rolled to the edge and dropped the rest of the way to the ground, landing hard in Mom's flower bed. Above, the broken bedroom window framed a dark opening. No sign of the clay figure, but I could hear movement inside, the sound of something large moving through the house. I ran toward the street, but stopped at the edge of our driveway. The pickup truck, or what had been a pickup truck, was directly in my path. Its surface undulated like water, and I could see what looked like faces forming and dissolving in the metal. Clay faces, all of them, with those same two wide grins. From the house came a sound like breaking glass, followed by wet splashing. The clay figure was coming down. I ran around the back of the truck and started down the street, not sure where I was going, but knowing I had to get away. Behind me, I heard the front door slam open and those wet footsteps on the porch. But when I reached the Hendersons' house and looked back, our driveway was empty. No red truck, no clay figure, no impossible vines covering the front porch. Just our house, looking perfectly normal in the gathering dusk. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, breathing hard and waiting for my heart to slow down. Maybe I'd fallen asleep over my chemistry homework. Maybe it had all been a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much studying and too little sleep. But when I finally worked up the courage to go back home, I found muddy footprints on the front porch that hadn't dried despite the cooling air. And pressed into our doormat was a single key, our spare key, covered in fresh clay that still gleamed wet in the porch light. The key I watched him use to get inside. Inside the house, everything looked normal. No broken windows, no vines, no holes in the ceiling. My chemistry homework still sat open on the dining room table, pencil exactly where I'd left it. But in the kitchen, muddy handprints covered the back door, and the deadbolt had been turned from the inside. I called Mom at work. The phone worked perfectly. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked after I'd stammered through some excuse about wanting to hear her voice. "Yeah," I said, staring at the muddy handprints. "Everything's fine." But as I hung up, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with fresh terror. On the kitchen floor, exactly where the clay drops had fallen, tiny green shoots were pushing up through the seemingly solid linoleum, growing, waiting. And outside, just at the edge of my hearing, I could swear I heard the distant rumble of a truck engine, circling the block with patient persistence. Story 10. The fluorescent lights of the office building cast their final sickly glow across the empty parking lot as I fumbled with my keys. The metal cold against fingers still cramped from 8 hours of typing reports. October had settled into the valley like a weight, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep chill that seeps through wool coats and stays there. My breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed off the mountains, a lonely sound that always made me think of departure, of things left behind. The drive home should have taken 45 minutes. It always took 45 minutes. Down the main highway for 30 miles, then the turn onto County Road 47, then the final stretch up the gravel path that wound through the sagebrush and scrub oak to my house. Sarah had always complained about the isolation when we were married, said it felt like living at the end of the world. Maybe that's why I stayed after she left, because sometimes the end of the world is exactly where you want to be. I'd been making this drive for 3 years now, and the routine had become a meditation of sorts. The radio would fade in and out depending on the mountains, classical music giving way to static, giving way to late-night talk shows where people called in to discuss their theories about government conspiracies and alien visitations. Tonight, though, the radio stayed silent. I'd tried multiple stations, but each one produced only a soft hiss, like air escaping from a tire. It was just past the 20-mile marker when I first noticed the single headlight in my rearview mirror. At first, I assumed it was a motorcycle. They weren't uncommon on this stretch of highway, even in October. But as the minutes passed and the light maintained its steady distance, never closer, never farther, something about it began to feel wrong. Motorcycles have a particular way of moving, a slight weave, even when traveling straight. This light held its position with mechanical precision, like it was tethered to my car by an invisible wire. I pressed the accelerator slightly, watching my speedometer climb from 65 to 70. The light stayed exactly where it was. I eased off the gas, dropping to 60. The distance remained constant. When I reached for the radio again, hoping for some distraction, my fingers found only the soft static, but now it seemed different, more purposeful, like breathing amplified through speakers. The turnoff to County Road 47 appeared in my headlights like a mouth opening in the darkness. I signaled, though there was no one else on the road to see it, and took the turn at my usual speed. The single light followed, making the turn with the same fluid precision I had, as if it knew exactly where I was going. County Road 47 was paved for the first 10 miles, then became gravel for the final stretch to my house. During the day, it was simply a rural road winding through typical high desert landscape. At night, it became something else entirely, a ribbon of uncertainty cutting through an ocean of black. I knew every curve, every pothole, every place where the shoulder dropped away into invisible arroyos. Tonight, though, the familiar felt alien. The transition from pavement to gravel always announced itself with a sudden change in the car's rhythm, the smooth hum of tires on asphalt, giving way to the crunch and scatter of small stones. But when I reached that transition point, what I heard instead was something that made me ease off the accelerator and strain my ears forward. The sound coming from beneath my car wasn't the familiar crunch of gravel. It was sharper, more brittle, like tires crushing coarse salt. I rolled down my window slightly, letting the cold air rush in, and the sound became clearer. Definitely salt. But that was impossible. The county didn't salt these roads. They barely maintained them. Behind me, the single light continued its pursuit, but now I realized I couldn't hear an engine. No rumble of a motorcycle, no purr of a car motor, just that same strange crushing sound, as if whatever was following me was also traveling over a surface of scattered salt crystals. I found myself gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, my knuckles white in the dashboard light. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations. Maybe the county had treated the road with something new. Maybe my hearing was playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation was finally getting to me the way it had gotten to Sarah. But logic has a way of abandoning you on dark roads, especially when you're alone and the world outside your headlights feels like it's watching. The gravel road to my house branched off to the right about 5 miles up County Road 47. It was barely wide enough for one car, winding up a gentle slope through clusters of pinyon pines and boulder formations that cast twisted shadows in the moonlight. I'd driven this path thousands of times, could navigate it blindfolded. But as I made the turn, something felt fundamentally different. The sound of salt under my tires grew louder, more insistent. I could taste it now too, that sharp mineral flavor that comes just before a nosebleed. My mouth felt dry despite the saliva that kept gathering under my tongue. Through my open window, the air carried a scent like dried seaweed, though the nearest ocean was 800 miles away. I checked my mirrors. The single light had followed me onto the narrow gravel path, maintaining its impossible distance. But now, in the confined space between the trees, I could see more clearly what was wrong with it. The light wasn't moving the way headlights should move. There was no bounce, no slight variation as it traveled over the uneven surface. It simply glided along, smooth as oil on water. My house sat at the top of the hill, a small ranch-style place with a wraparound porch and windows that Sarah had once filled with plants. I could see it now in my headlights, exactly as I'd left it that morning. But as I pulled into my usual parking spot beside the porch steps, something happened that made my stomach drop like I'd stepped off a cliff. I turned off my engine and looked in my rearview mirror. The single light was there, perhaps 20 feet behind me, illuminating the space between us with that cold, unwavering beam. But the vehicle it belonged to, there was no vehicle. The light simply hung in the air, unsupported, casting its glow across the gravel and salt that covered my driveway like snow. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The light remained, floating, impossible. I turned off my headlights, plunging my car into darkness, expecting the other light to disappear, some trick of reflection or tired eyes. Instead, it brightened, and in that brightening, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. Footprints. Human footprints. Clearly defined in the salt that I now realized covered not just the driveway, but my entire car. They started at the ground near the floating light and moved in a straight line toward my car, up over the trunk, across the roof, down the windshield, as if someone invisible had walked across my vehicle while I sat inside it. The prints were bare feet, adult-sized, with distinct impressions of toes and heels. They glowed faintly in the strange light, as if the salt had been heated by whatever had made them. I could see them clearly through my windshield. 5 toes, an arch, a heel, then another step. Someone had walked the length of my car while I was driving. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight I kept in my glove compartment. The metal felt heavier than usual, and when I clicked it on, the beam seemed weak, yellowish. I opened my car door slowly, the hinges creaking in the silence. The moment I stepped outside, the air changed. What had been cold and dry became thick, humid, saturated with that oceanic scent. My flashlight beam, which should have cut through the darkness like a sword, instead seemed to sink into it, absorbed by something that wasn't quite fog but wasn't quite air either. I aimed the flashlight at the footprints on my car. They were still there, still glowing faintly, but now I could see that the salt wasn't just on my vehicle. It covered everything. The ground, the porch steps, the railings, even the tree branches looked like they'd been dusted with fine white crystals. It was as if someone had taken the entire world and dipped it in brine. The floating light behind me pulsed once, then twice like a heartbeat made visible. I turned toward it, raising my flashlight, but the beam simply disappeared into a wall of what I can only describe as crystallized air. The moisture in my mouth evaporated instantly, leaving my tongue feeling like sandpaper. The skin on my face tightened, and when I licked my lips, they tasted like metal pennies. I tried to speak, to call out some challenge or question to whatever was causing this, but my voice emerged as a whisper that seemed to be absorbed by the salt-thick air before it could travel more than a few feet. The silence that surrounded me wasn't the absence of sound. It was something heavier, more present, like being wrapped in cotton that muffled not just noise but thought itself. The footprints on my car began to glow brighter. I could see them multiplying, new prints appearing as I watched. Someone, something, was walking across my vehicle again, right now, while I stood there. The metal groaned softly under weight I couldn't see, and flakes of salt scattered from the hood onto the ground. I backed toward my front door, the flashlight feeling increasingly useless in my hand. Each step I took left my own footprints in the salt, but unlike the others, mine remained dark, unilluminated. Behind me, the floating light pulsed again, and I could swear I heard something like breathing. Not the in-and-out rhythm of lungs, but something else. Something that sounded like wind moving through empty shells. My key turned in the lock with difficulty, the mechanism grinding as if filled with sand. Inside, my house felt different. The familiar smells of coffee and old wood were gone, replaced by that overwhelming oceanic scent. When I flicked the light switch, the bulbs came on, but their glow seemed muted, filtered through the same crystallized air that had swallowed my flashlight beam outside. I moved to the front window and peered through the curtains. The floating light was still there, closer now, perhaps 10 feet from my porch. The footprints on my car were multiplying exponentially, a highway of bare feet crossing and recrossing the metal surface. But now I could see more. Handprints on my windows, smeared shapes that suggested fingers and palms pressed against the glass from the inside. That's when I noticed my own reflection in the window wasn't quite right. My face looked back at me, but it was covered in the same fine layer of salt that coated everything else. My eyes appeared sunken, darkened, and when I raised my hand to touch my cheek, my reflection didn't mirror the movement exactly. There was a delay, a slight hesitation, as if my reflection was considering whether to follow my lead. I stepped back from the window, and my reflection remained at the glass for a moment longer before mimicking my movement. The taste of metal in my mouth had grown stronger, and I realized my nose was bleeding, small drops of red that looked black in the strange light filtering through my windows. The phone sat on the kitchen counter where I'd left it that morning, but when I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone. Instead, I heard what sounded like waves lapping against a distant shore, rhythmic and soft. I dialed 911 anyway, but the numbers on the keypad seemed to rearrange themselves as I pressed them. Where there should have been a 9, I found a symbol I didn't recognize. Where the 1 should have been, there was what looked like a tiny drawing of an eye. I set the phone down carefully and moved to the back of the house, to the bedroom that faced away from the driveway. Through that window, I could see my backyard, which should have been familiar grass and the small garden Sarah had planted before she left. Instead, I saw an expanse of white that stretched to the horizon, not snow, but salt, formed into dunes and valleys that shifted slowly in a wind I couldn't feel. In the distance, lights moved across this salt desert, not the harsh single beam that had followed me home, but softer glows that bobbed and weaved like lanterns carried by travelers. As I watched, they seemed to be approaching, growing larger and more distinct. Soon I could make out the silhouettes carrying them, human shapes that walked with purpose across the impossible landscape. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, a technique my therapist had taught me years ago when the anxiety attacks were at their worst. When I opened them, the salt desert was still there, and the figures were closer. Close enough that I could see they left no footprints in the white sand. Close enough that I could see their lanterns weren't electric lights, but something that glowed from within, like captured stars. The bleeding from my nose had increased, and when I wiped it with the back of my hand, the blood was streaked with white. Salt crystals mixed with red, forming patterns on my skin that looked almost like writing in a language I couldn't read, but somehow understood meant one thing: you've been chosen. I returned to the living room and sat heavily on the couch, the flashlight still clutched in my hand, though it had become completely useless. Outside, I could hear new sounds, footsteps on my porch, but not the heavy boots of someone trying to break in. These were the same bare feet that had walked across my car, soft and purposeful. The doorknob turned slowly, though I was certain I had locked it. The door opened with a whisper of hinges, and salt-thick air flowed into my house like water. But no one entered. The doorway remained empty, a rectangle of crystallized darkness that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. I understood then that this wasn't about someone coming to get me. This was about me going somewhere else. The floating light, the footprints, the salt desert beyond my window. They weren't invasions of my world. They were invitations to leave it. The taste of metal in my mouth had become so strong I could barely swallow. My reflection in the dark window was now completely independent, moving and gesturing in ways that had nothing to do with my actions. When I stood up, it remained seated. When I raised my hand, it turned away. The figures carrying lanterns had reached my backyard. They stood at the edge of the salt dunes, waiting, patient as tides. Their lights bobbed gently, hypnotically, and I found myself walking toward the back door without consciously deciding to do so. My hand was on the doorknob when I stopped. Something in me, the part that still remembered Sarah's laugh, that still tasted coffee from that morning, that still felt the weight of car keys in my pocket, pulled back. I wasn't ready. Not yet. I turned away from the door and sat back down on the couch. Outside, the floating light pulsed once more, then began to fade. The footprints on my car gradually dimmed. The figures in the salt desert turned and walked back toward the horizon, their lanterns growing smaller and smaller until they were just stars again. But they didn't disappear entirely. They never do. I still live in the house at the end of the gravel road. I still make the drive home from work each night. And sometimes, not every night, but often enough, I see that single light in my rearview mirror. Sometimes I hear the sound of salt under my tires, Sometimes I taste metal in my mouth and find my reflection acting independently in windows and mirrors. The figures are always waiting at the edge of the salt desert that exists just beyond my back door. They're patient. They understand that these things take time, that the crossing from one world to another can't be rushed. And I understand now that the question isn't whether what I experienced was real or some elaborate hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. The question is whether it matters. Because every night when I look in the mirror, my reflection looks a little less like me and a little more like one of those patient figures carrying lanterns across impossible landscapes. The salt is still there, on my car, on my windows, in my blood. It's always there now, a reminder that some roads, once traveled, mark you forever. That some followers, once acknowledged, never really leave. Tonight, when I make the drive home, I know the single light will be there again. And I know that someday soon, instead of leading it to my house, I'll turn around and follow it back to wherever it comes from. The lanterns are waiting. They're always waiting. And I'm almost ready to carry one myself. Story 11. The radio shouldn't have been there. I found it on my third week working the graveyard shift at the Postal Distribution Center, tucked behind a stack of misdelivered packages in the far corner of Warehouse C. The facility sprawled across 15 acres of cracked asphalt 20 minutes outside Millbrook, connected to civilization by a single access road that disappeared into cornfields. During the day, trucks rumbled in and out, workers sorted packages with mechanical efficiency, and supervisors barked orders through handheld radios. But at night, the place transformed into something else entirely, a cavern of shadows and silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant groaning of settling metal. The radio was old, probably from the 70s, with a scratched chrome face and a telescoping antenna bent at an odd angle. Its power cord had been spliced and respliced with electrical tape, and someone had carved initials into the plastic casing, RM 1979. It wasn't in any inventory sheet I'd seen, and God knows I'd memorized every piece of equipment in this place during my endless rounds. I should have reported it, should have tagged it, and sent it to the office for processing. Instead, I plugged it into the outlet behind the sorting table and turned the dial. Static hissed through the speakers, occasionally broken by fragments of distant AM stations. Talk radio hosts discussing agricultural futures, late-night DJs spinning forgotten classics, truckers checking in with dispatchers. Nothing unusual. I left it on low volume as I made my rounds, the white noise a welcome companion in the oppressive quiet. The first incident happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after I'd found the radio. I was finishing my 3 a.m. walkthrough when I heard voices drifting from Warehouse C. Not the usual radio chatter. These were whispers, soft and urgent, like people sharing secrets in a library. I quickened my pace, thinking maybe some workers had come in early or forgotten to clock out. But when I reached the warehouse, the space was empty except for the towering shelves of packages and the radio glowing softly in the corner. The voices were coming from the radio. I approached slowly, my flashlight beam dancing across the concrete floor. The dial was set to 1570 AM, a frequency that usually carried nothing but static out here. But the voices continued, a man and woman speaking in hushed tones, their words indistinct but somehow familiar. Then I heard my name. Marcus Vaughn, 1247 Elm Street, the woman's voice whispered. Package sent from Portland, Oregon. Contents, books, personal effects, correspondence. My blood turned to ice water. 1247. Elm Street was my address. The package she described had arrived 2 days ago, a box of my grandmother's belongings that my aunt had shipped after cleaning out the old woman's house. The male voice picked up where she left off. Jennifer Martinez, 892 Oak Avenue. Package sent from Denver, Colorado. Contents: clothing, jewelry, photograph album. I knew that package too. Third shelf, section B7. A woman's careful handwriting on the label, a return address I'd noticed because Denver was where I'd grown up. Robert Chen, 445 Pine Boulevard, the woman continued. Package sent from Sacramento, California. Contents: electronics, warranty cards, installation manual. Package after package, the voices read through the inventory with mechanical precision. Every address was accurate, every sender's location correct, every description matching what I'd personally handled and sorted over the past month. It was impossible. The contents of packages weren't listed on shipping labels, and certainly weren't broadcast over radio waves. I reached for the dial to change the station, but the moment my fingers touched the chrome, both voices stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was deeper than before, pressing against my eardrums like cotton stuffed in my skull. Behind me, something shifted. A soft scraping sound, like cardboard against concrete. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and saw them. The packages were moving. Not dramatically, no violent shaking or supernatural theatrics. Just a subtle trembling, as if something inside each box was stirring restlessly. 1,000 containers, arranged in neat rows on metal shelving, all pulsing with quiet life. The movement was synchronized, rising and falling like a massive organism breathing in slow motion. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The packages were still. "You're losing it, Marcus," I whispered to myself, the sound of my own voice strange and hollow in the cavernous space. "You're working too many doubles, not getting enough sleep." But when I turned back to the radio, the voices had resumed their litany. New names now, addresses I didn't recognize, packages that hadn't arrived yet but would. Tomorrow, next week, next month. The voices knew things they couldn't know, described shipments that existed only in the future. I yanked the power cord from the wall. The silence that followed was profound, but it lasted only seconds before the scraping began again. This time, I forced myself to watch. The packages weren't moving randomly. They were turning, rotating slowly on the shelves, as if whatever lived inside was trying to orient itself, trying to face something, trying to face me. I ran. The next night I approached Warehouse C with the caution of a man walking into a snake den. The radio sat exactly where I'd left it, dark and innocent. I completed my rounds without turning it on, but sleep was impossible when I got home. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those whispered voices cataloging my neighbors' lives, describing the contents of packages with impossible accuracy. I started researching the radio during my off hours. The initials carved into the case, RM 1979, led me to the local library's newspaper archives. I found what I was looking for in a yellowed copy of the Millbrook Gazette from August 1979. Local man missing after postal facility incident. Roger Manning, night supervisor at the Postal Distribution Center, had vanished during his shift on August 15, 1979. The article was brief, speculating about voluntary disappearance due to financial troubles. But a follow-up piece 2 weeks later mentioned that Manning's personal radio had been found in Warehouse C, still plugged in and tuned to an empty frequency. Family members report Manning had become increasingly obsessed with what he called messages in the static, the reporter had written. Co-workers described erratic behavior in the weeks before his disappearance, including claims that packages in the facility were trying to communicate with him. I stopped reading and sat back in my chair, the microfilm reader humming softly in the empty library. Roger Manning had found the same radio 46 years ago. He'd heard the same voices, witnessed the same impossible movements, and then he'd vanished. That night, I arrived at work determined to avoid Warehouse C entirely. I could patrol the other buildings, check the loading docks, monitor the security cameras from the office. There was no reason to enter that particular building. But at 3:33 a.m., I noted the time later, realizing its significance only afterward. The main power grid flickered. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the facility in an eerie red glow, and the security monitors went dark. Protocol required a manual check of all buildings during power outages, which meant I had no choice but to enter Warehouse C. The radio was on. Not just on. The display glowed bright green, and the antenna was fully extended, reaching toward the ceiling like a metallic finger. I hadn't plugged it in. I was certain I hadn't plugged it in. The voices were different this time. Younger, more urgent, speaking faster than before. They were reading names I'd never heard, addresses in cities I'd never visited, describing packages that contained increasingly personal items, love letters, family photographs, medical records, diary pages. Sarah Kellerman, 1893. Maple Drive, the woman's voice whispered. Package sent from Boston, Massachusetts. Contents: pregnancy test, positive result. Letter to estranged mother. David Pratt, 567 First Street. The man continued. Package sent from Miami, Florida. Contents: divorce papers, house keys, suicide note. I wanted to leave, to run back to the office and call in sick, but my feet wouldn't move. The voices held me transfixed, revealing secrets that should have remained hidden, broadcasting intimate details of strangers' lives into the empty air. It felt like eavesdropping on confessions, like standing invisible in other people's bedrooms. Marcus Vaughn, the woman's voice said, and my heart hammered against my ribs. Package sent from Phoenix, Arizona. Contents: psychiatric evaluation, discharge papers, medication schedule. No, I whispered, but the man's voice picked up the thread. Commitment papers, signed and notarized. Medical records indicating acute paranoid episodes, auditory hallucinations, recommendation for extended observation. That's not real, I said louder, backing away from the radio. There is no package like that. The voices continued relentlessly. Sender's note attached. Marcus needs help. He claims to hear voices through electronic devices, believes inanimate objects are communicating with him. Please ensure delivery to his current address for mandatory evaluation. I lunged for the radio, intending to smash it against the floor, but stopped when I saw the package. It sat on the sorting table directly beneath the radio, a brown cardboard box secured with rough sisal rope. No shipping label, no return address, no postal markings of any kind. The rope was tied in an elaborate knot I'd never seen before, all loops and twists that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. This was the package the voices had described, the one that had appeared after they'd announced an unknown name the night before. But I couldn't remember any unknown name. I couldn't remember when this package had arrived or how it had gotten onto the sorting table. I reached for the knot, intending to untie it, but my fingers couldn't find the beginning or end of the rope. The strands seemed to weave through themselves in impossible ways, creating a puzzle that had no solution. The harder I pulled, the tighter the knot became, until the rope began to cut into the cardboard itself. Behind me, the scraping sound began again. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see. Every package in Warehouse C was moving now, not just trembling but rotating actively, creating a symphony of cardboard against metal, plastic against concrete. The sound built to a crescendo that seemed to emanate from inside my skull, and through it all, the radio voices continued their endless catalog. Marcus Vaughn, they said in unison. Marcus Vaughn, Marcus Vaughn. The packages were all facing me now, hundreds of containers arranged like an audience in an amphitheater. Some were large enough to hold furniture, others small enough for jewelry. All of them pulsed with that same rhythmic breathing. All of them seemed to watch me with invisible eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted over the noise. The scraping stopped instantly. The radio fell silent. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of electrical systems throughout the facility. Then, from inside the unnamed package on the sorting table, came a new sound. Soft scratching, like fingernails on cardboard. Something was trying to get out. I backed toward the warehouse exit, but my legs felt heavy, as if I were walking through deep water. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and the sisal rope began to loosen on its own. Loop by loop, the impossible knot unraveled itself, revealing glimpses of the box's interior. The radio crackled back to life. Package contents: mirror, cracked and aged. Reflection shows truth sender intended recipient to see. Warning: image may cause severe psychological distress. The rope fell away entirely. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee the warehouse and never return. Instead, I approached the package with the slow, inevitable movement of a sleepwalker. My hands moved without conscious direction, lifting the cardboard flaps, peering into the darkness within. The mirror was small, maybe 6 inches square, with an ornate silver frame that looked much older than its packaging suggested. The glass was cracked in a spiderweb pattern that seemed to pulse with faint light. When I lifted it from the box, the surface felt warm against my palms. I looked into it and saw myself, but wrong. The reflection showed me in the same warehouse, wearing the same uniform, holding the same mirror. But my face was different. Older, more weathered, with deep lines around my eyes and gray threading through my hair. Behind me, instead of packages on shelves, stood rows of people. Men and women of all ages, all wearing the same blue postal uniform, all staring directly at me with expressions of infinite sadness. Roger Manning stood in the front row. "Welcome home, Marcus," his reflected mouth said, though no sound emerged from the mirror itself. "We've been waiting for you." The other figures nodded in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized. I recognized some of their faces from old newspaper clippings I'd found in my research. Postal workers who had disappeared over the decades, all of them last seen in this facility, all of them associated with reports of strange phenomena and electronic voices. I dropped the mirror. It struck the concrete floor with a crystalline crash, and the reflected figures scattered like startled birds. But when the pieces settled, each shard showed the same image. My own face, aged and worn, surrounded by the ghostly postal workers. From every broken fragment, Roger Manning's voice whispered, "You can't leave, Marcus. None of us can leave. We're part of the system now, part of the network. Every package tells a story, and we're here to make sure every story gets delivered." The radio voices resumed their catalog, but now I could distinguish individual speakers. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all former workers who had discovered the truth about this place. The packages weren't just containers for shipping, they were repositories for human secrets, for the intimate details that people tried to send away or hide from view. And we were the custodians, the unwilling guardians of things too personal to be entrusted to anyone else. "Marcus Vaughn," my own voice joined the chorus, though my mouth never moved. "Marcus Vaughn, 1247 Elm Street, package contents. Sanity, carefully wrapped and ready for shipment. Destination, unknown." I understand now why Roger Manning never left, why none of them ever left. The facility isn't just a postal distribution center, it's a collection point for human experiences, a place where the things we try to ship away from ourselves come to rest. Every package contains a piece of someone's life, and someone has to stay here to make sure those pieces are protected. The voices are calling my name again. It's 3:33 a.m., and they want me to help with the inventory. There are new packages arriving, packages that won't appear on any shipping manifest, but will find their way here nonetheless. Packages containing fears and memories, regrets and secrets, all the things people hope to send somewhere else but that always seem to find their way back. I've stopped trying to untie the sisal rope. Some knots aren't meant to be loosened. The radio is calling and I have work to do. Story 12. The house came with its ghosts, though I didn't know it then. When Uncle Marcus died and left me the narrow Victorian twin in the historic district, I thought I'd won some cosmic lottery. 3 stories of weathered brick and ornate ironwork, squeezed between identical structures like books on a shelf. The real estate agent mentioned the building's age, 1890, with the reverence reserved for antiques, as if the decades themselves had polished the hardwood floors to their current amber gleam. I should have paid more attention to why the place had sat empty for 2 years. The moving truck left on a Tuesday afternoon, and I spent my first evening wandering through rooms that still held the phantom impressions of Uncle Marcus's furniture. The wallpaper bore rectangular shadows where paintings had hung for decades, and the floorboards creaked out a map of his daily routes. But it was the attic that called to me, accessible only through a narrow staircase hidden behind what I'd initially mistaken for a closet door. The space stretched the full length of the house, with dormer windows at either end casting long rectangles of amber light across the dusty floorboards. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, Uncle Marcus's final possessions awaiting my judgment. But dominating the center of the room stood a grandfather clock that had clearly seen better decades. The mahogany case rose nearly 8 feet, its wood darkened to the color of old blood. Brass fittings had tarnished green, and the glass door protecting the pendulum chamber hung slightly ajar. But it was the clock face that arrested my attention. The Roman numerals remained crisp and black against cream-colored enamel, but the hands were gone. Not broken off. Gone. As if they had simply evaporated, leaving only a brass pin at the center like a steel eye watching the room. I spent that first night cataloging Uncle Marcus's belongings, occasionally glancing at the handless clock. The face seemed expectant, waiting for something I couldn't name. By midnight, fatigue made my vision blur, and I retreated to the bedroom on the second floor, leaving the attic to its patient silence. The ticking started the next evening. I was reviewing case files in the living room when the sound drifted down through the ceiling, a steady, measured rhythm that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Not the hollow tick of a working clock, but something deeper, more resonant, as if the house's wooden bones were keeping time. The sound pulled at something primal in my chest, the way a metronome can hypnotize even when you're not trying to listen. Grabbing a flashlight, I climbed to the attic. The space lay draped in shadows, the grandfather clock a silent sentinel in the center. I approached slowly, my footsteps muffled by dust. The clock face remained blank, its missing hands offering no explanation for the rhythmic percussion that had drawn me upstairs. Yet even as I stood before it, the ticking continued, seeming to emanate from the walls, the floor, the very air. I pressed my ear to the clock case. Nothing. The sound surrounded me but had no source, like trying to locate the origin of an echo in a canyon. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, I gave up and went to bed, though the ticking followed me into sleep, weaving itself into my dreams like a lullaby written in Morse code. The pattern established itself over the following week. Each evening, as darkness claimed the narrow streets outside, the ticking would begin. I tried everything, checking the house's heating system, examining the walls for loose pipes, even calling the utility company about possible electrical issues. The serviceman found nothing amiss, though he did comment on the house's remarkable soundproofing. Sound seemed to move strangely through the old structure, he noted, bouncing off surfaces in unexpected ways. It was during my second week in the house that I discovered the objects. I'd climbed to the attic following another evening of phantom ticking, this time determined to move the grandfather clock entirely. But as my flashlight beam swept across the floor, something glinted near the clock's base. My cell phone lay there, face down against the dusty floorboards. I'd been searching for it all evening, certain I'd left it charging in the kitchen. The phone rested precisely at the base of the clock, positioned where the numeral 8 would sit if projected onto the floor. As I picked it up, checking for damage, a chill crawled up my spine. The placement seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if someone had carefully positioned it as an offering to the handless timepiece. I rationalized it away. The phone must have fallen from my pocket during one of my previous visits to the attic. The position was coincidental. The human mind, I reminded myself, excels at finding patterns even where none exist. But the next evening, I found my car keys at the base of the clock, positioned where 11 o'clock would be. The evening after that, my wallet appeared at the 12 position. Each discovery sent electricity coursing through my nervous system. I began checking the attic multiple times per day, documenting the positions of objects with my phone's camera. The items were always my personal belongings, things I'd touched, carried, used. Never anything that belonged to Uncle Marcus or the house itself, and always positioned with mathematical precision around the clock's base, as if marking hours on an invisible clock face. I started keeping my belongings locked in a desk drawer downstairs, but it made no difference. Objects continued to appear, my reading glasses at the 2 position, a pen at the 5, my coffee mug at the 7. Each discovery felt like a violation, as if invisible hands were rifling through my life, selecting artifacts for some unknown purpose. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the nightly ticking, my mind cataloging every creak and settling sound the old house made. The noise seemed to pulse with intention, as if the building itself had developed a heartbeat. Some nights I was certain I could hear footsteps in the attic above, slow and deliberate, circling the grandfather clock like a ritual dance. But it was during the third week that I witnessed the impossible. I'd taken to sleeping in shifts, dozing fitfully until around 3 a.m., then making my way to the attic to check on the clock. The routine had become compulsive, a nervous habit I couldn't shake. That particular morning, I climbed the narrow stairs with practiced stealth, flashlight in hand, expecting to find another of my possessions arranged around the clock's base. Instead, I found something that made my rational mind stumble and fall. A thin line of silver light was rotating slowly around the clock face, a second hand materializing from nothing, tracing its endless circle in the air 6 inches from the glass. Not attached to the central pin, not supported by any visible mechanism, but turning with metronomic precision, casting a faint glow against the clock's cream-colored dial. I stood transfixed, watching this impossible hand sweep through its circuit. The light was cold and pale, like moonlight reflected off water. It moved with perfect regularity, neither speeding up nor slowing down, as if disconnected from the physical laws that govern the rest of the world. Then I saw where it was pointing. As the ethereal hand swept past each numeral, the floorboard directly below would emit a soft crack, not the sound of breaking wood, but of something shifting, settling, marking its position. When the hand pointed to 3 o'clock, a hairline fracture appeared in the oak plank at my feet. At 6 o'clock, another crack materialized across the room. Each position left its mark, as if the hand was etching some invisible map into the attic floor. I watched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The hand completed several full rotations, each circuit leaving new fractures in the floorboards. The pattern seemed random at first, but gradually I began to see the design emerging, lines radiating outward from the clock like spokes on a wheel, connecting various points around the attic's perimeter. And then the hand stopped. It hung motionless at the 7 position, its silver light pulsing gently. I followed its direction with my flashlight beam, across the dusty floor, past stacked boxes and draped furniture, to the narrow staircase leading down to the 2nd floor. The hand was pointing directly at the path to my bedroom. The light faded gradually, like a dying ember, until the hand disappeared entirely. I stood alone in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the fresh crack that marked the 7 o'clock position. The crack pointed like an arrow toward the stairs, toward my room, toward me. That morning, I didn't return to bed. I sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and watching the sun rise through the narrow windows, trying to convince myself I'd been dreaming. But the images remained crystal clear. The floating hand, the appearing cracks, the deliberate pointing toward my sleeping quarters. I began researching the house's history, spending my days at the public library and city records office. Uncle Marcus had lived there for 40 years, but the house had sheltered many families before him. The original owner, Samuel Meridian, had been a clockmaker who'd built the place as both home and workshop. According to city records, he died in the attic in 1923, found slumped over his workbench after neighbors reported hearing his clocks chiming at all hours for days on end. The house had changed hands frequently after that. Families would move in, live there for a few years, then abruptly relocate. The pattern repeated through the decades. No tragedies, no obvious problems, just a steady turnover of residents who seemed unwilling or unable to stay long. I found Uncle Marcus's diary in a box labeled personal. His entries from the last few years painted a picture of growing isolation and obsession. He wrote about the nightly ticking, about objects moving on their own, about a presence in the attic that watched and waited. His final entry, dated just weeks before his death, consisted of a single line repeated 47 times. 7 points to 7 points to 7. The revelation chilled me more than any supernatural manifestation. Uncle Marcus had experienced the same phenomena. The floating hand, the moving objects, the sense of being observed by something invisible and patient. And in the end, it had consumed him, driven him into a spiral of paranoia and isolation. But knowing the truth didn't diminish its power. If anything, Confirmation made the nightly visitations more terrifying. I wasn't losing my mind. Something was happening in that attic, something that had been happening for decades. The grandfather clock was more than an antique. It was a focal point for forces I couldn't understand or control. I began sleeping with my bedroom door locked, though I knew it was a meaningless gesture. Whatever haunted the attic wasn't bound by physical barriers. It moved through walls, manipulated objects from a distance, and marked time according to laws beyond human comprehension. The hand appeared every night now, always completing its circuit of cracks before stopping at 7 o'clock, pointing toward my room. The fractures in the attic floor formed an increasingly complex pattern, a mandala of broken wood with the grandfather clock at its center. Each crack seemed to pulse with subtle energy, as if the floor itself had been transformed into some kind of supernatural circuit board. I tried leaving the house, spending nights in hotels, but the pull was irresistible. Something drew me back each evening, a compulsion that felt stronger than my own will. The house had claimed me just as it had claimed Uncle Marcus and all the residents before him. We were moths attracted to a flame we couldn't see, dancers following music only we could hear. Last night, the hand's behavior changed. Instead of pointing to 7 and disappearing, it began moving backwards, counterclockwise, stopping at each numeral for several seconds before continuing its reverse journey. At each position, the corresponding crack in the floor would glow faintly, as if lit from beneath. The pattern of light spread outward from the clock like ripples on a pond, connecting the various fractures in a web of pale illumination. When the hand reached 12, the entire pattern blazed with cold fire. The attic filled with that silver light, casting everything in stark relief. And in that moment of illumination, I saw them. The shadowy figures standing around the room's perimeter, dozens of them, all facing the grandfather clock with patient expectation. The residents who had come before me, Samuel Meridian at his workbench, Uncle Marcus with his diary, families and individuals stretching back through the decades, all drawn to this place, all marked by the same inexplicable force. They weren't ghosts in any traditional sense, more like impressions, echoes of lives that had been lived under the clock's influence. They turned to look at me with eyes that held no malice, only understanding. They knew what I was experiencing because they had experienced it themselves. The nightly visitations, the moving objects, the sense of being watched, all part of a pattern that had been repeating for over a century. The hand completed its reverse circuit and began moving forward again, accelerating with each revolution. Faster and faster it spun, until it became a blur of silver light, and the cracks in the floor began to spread, connecting and multiplying, forming new patterns, new designs. When it stopped, it was pointing not at 7 but at 6, directly at the wall that separated my bedroom from the neighboring house. I'm writing this now as the sun sets, casting long shadows through the narrow windows. The ticking has already begun, that familiar rhythm that seems to emanate from the house's very bones. Soon I'll climb the stairs to the attic, drawn by the same compulsion that has claimed every resident before me. I understand now that leaving isn't an option. The grandfather clock doesn't just measure time, it harvests it, collecting moments and memories from the lives that pass through its influence. We're all part of its mechanism now, components in a device whose purpose remains beautifully, terrifyingly unclear. The hand is moving again, somewhere above my head, tracing its endless circuit. Tonight, it might point to 5. Tomorrow, perhaps 4. Eventually, inevitably, it will reach 1, and then 12, and then some position that doesn't exist on any earthly timepiece. I wonder what happens when the hand has nowhere left to point, when the pattern is complete and the clock has claimed all the time it needs. I suppose I'll find out soon enough. The ticking grows louder now, calling me upstairs. The grandfather is waiting, patient as always, ready to show me whatever comes next in this dance we've been performing for over a century. I close this journal and place it carefully on the kitchen table, where the next resident will find it. Perhaps they'll heed the warning and flee before the clock marks them as its own. Perhaps they'll be stronger than Uncle Marcus, stronger than me. But probably not. The grandfather clock keeps perfect time after all, and time always wins in the end. Story 13. The silence here has weight. It presses against my eardrums like water at depth, thick and suffocating in ways that make me check my watch every few minutes just to hear something tick. The Grand Meridian Spa Resort has been abandoned for 3 years, but the silence feels older, prehistoric, as if sound itself had died in these halls long before the last guest checked out. I came here to catalog medical equipment for the insurance company. Simple work: photograph, document condition, estimate value. The kind of mundane task that usually takes 2 days and pays well enough to ignore the creeping dread that settles in abandoned places. Except I've been here a week now, and my clipboard holds only half-completed forms. The pool is the problem. It sits at the heart of the facility, a pristine, Olympic-sized basin beneath a soaring glass dome that should let in light but somehow doesn't. The water disappeared when they shut off the pumps, leaving behind only smooth concrete and the faint mineral smell of chlorine that never quite fades. During my morning rounds, I cataloged the diving boards, the lane markers still hanging like party streamers for a celebration that never came. The space echoes with phantom splashes, the memory of water so strong I sometimes catch myself listening for swimmers. But come afternoon, something changes. I first noticed it on day 3. The light through the dome shifted, not dimmed exactly, but became somehow heavier, more substantial. The empty pool seemed to exhale, a long, patient sigh that raised goosebumps along my arms. I attributed it to air pressure, to the old building settling, to my own imagination running wild in a place where imagination had too much room to roam. Then I saw the water. It didn't flow in from pipes or drains. There was no sound of rushing liquid, no splash or gurgle. One moment the pool was empty. The next it held inches of dark water that reflected nothing. Not the dome above, not my face as I leaned over the edge. The surface was perfectly still for maybe 30 seconds, then began to move. Not waves, not ripples. Movement, like breathing. The water rose and fell in a rhythm so steady, so organic, that I found myself synchronizing my own breath to match. In, hold, out. In, hold, out. The pattern was hypnotic, almost soothing, until I realized what I was doing and jerked back from the edge. That's when the vapor started. Wisps of steam, no, not steam, something colder, began rising from the surface. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Chlorine, yes, but not the sharp, clean scent of pool chemicals. This was chlorine gone wrong, aged and corrupted, mixed with something else, something medical. The smell of hospital corridors and rubber gloves and that particular antiseptic they use to mask the scent of sickness. I left my clipboard on the pool deck and went back to my room. The next morning, the pool was empty again, bone dry, as if it had never held water at all. But my clipboard was gone. I found it that afternoon floating in the center of the breathing pool. The metal clip had been carefully removed, my papers separated and arranged in a neat stack. Everything held together by a hospital wristband. The plastic was yellowed with age, but the text was clear. My name, printed in blocky institutional font, followed by a room number I didn't recognize. I used the pool skimmer to fish it out, my hands shaking as I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Former patients had left belongings behind, maintenance workers playing pranks. Anything but the growing certainty that something in this place knew me, was studying me, preparing for something I couldn't name. The water level rose higher each afternoon. By day 5, it reached the pool's edge, a perfect mirror that breathed in slow, measured cycles. The vapor came thicker now, rolling across the deck in lazy clouds that made my eyes water and my throat burn. I stopped trying to catalog the pool area, instead focusing on the physical therapy equipment in the eastern wing. Parallel bars, exercise bikes, ultrasound machines, familiar territory that didn't shift or breathe or watch me with an awareness I could feel but not prove. But even there, I wasn't alone. The feeling started as an itch between my shoulder blades, the primitive sensation of being observed. I'd turn quickly, expecting to catch someone in my peripheral vision, but the corridors remained empty. Security cameras hung from the ceiling like dead eyes, their lenses clouded with dust. No power meant no recording, no watching, at least nothing electronic. The first voice came on day 6. I was photographing a hydrotherapy tank when I heard it, muffled and distant but unmistakably human. The words were unclear, spoken as if through water or layers of glass, but the tone was inviting, welcoming. A host greeting an expected guest. I followed the sound through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they had that morning, past treatment rooms with their doors standing open like mouths. The voice led me in circles, always just around the next corner, until I realized I was being drawn back to the pool. The breathing had accelerated. What had been slow, steady inhalations now came quick and shallow, like someone hyperventilating or drowning in reverse. The water at the pool's edge sloshed gently, not quite spilling over but threatening to with each agitated breath. The vapor rolled in waves now, dense enough to sting my lungs and blur my vision. Through the mist, I saw shapes moving beneath the surface. They weren't swimming exactly. The movement was too coordinated, too purposeful. More like floating, like bodies arranged in careful formation, rising and sinking with the water's breath. I couldn't make out details through the roiling vapor, just the suggestion of limbs, the pale blur of faces that might have been looking up at me. The voice came again, clearer now, speaking words that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest. "Enter and return the breath you took from us." I ran. My feet slapped against polished floors as I sprinted through corridors that felt increasingly unfamiliar, past doorways that opened onto rooms I hadn't seen before. Treatment rooms became patient rooms, became something else entirely. Spaces with medical equipment I didn't recognize. Machines that hummed with phantom power despite the building's dead electrical system. I didn't stop until I reached my temporary quarters on the 3rd floor, a converted office where I'd set up my laptop and sleeping bag. I locked the door, though against what I couldn't say, and sat on my narrow cot, trying to convince myself that isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But when morning came, I found the footprints. Wet impressions led from the stairwell to my door, then stopped. Not faded or dried, but sharply defined, as if someone had just walked this path. The prints were bare feet, and there were too many of them. Overlapping tracks that suggested not one visitor, but several. All walking in single file, all ending at my threshold. I photographed them with my phone, though the images came out strangely distorted, the watermark seeming to shift and blur even in still pictures. When I looked again an hour later, the hallway was dry. That afternoon, I packed. 3 years of physical therapy work had taught me to recognize when a patient's condition was deteriorating, when continued treatment might cause more harm than healing. This place, whatever was happening here, felt like a patient I couldn't help, shouldn't help. The insurance company could find someone else to finish the catalog, but the pool had other plans. I was loading my car when I heard it, not the muffled voice from before, but something clearer, more urgent. Multiple voices now, overlapping in harmony, singing something that might have been a lullaby or might have been a dirge. The melody was hauntingly familiar, like a half-remembered song from childhood, and despite every rational instinct, I found myself walking back toward the building. The pool deck was flooded. Not just the pool itself, but the entire surrounding area, inches of dark water that reflected the dome above in perfect, impossible detail. The breathing had stopped. The surface lay perfectly still, so mirror-like it seemed I could step through it into another world, one where the dome was clean and bright, where the building hummed with life instead of emptiness. My belongings floated in careful arrangement around the pool's perimeter, not just the clipboard this time, but items from my room, my laptop bag, my clothes, even my car keys, all tied with hospital wristbands bearing my name. The bands weren't yellow anymore, but fresh white, the kind they'd snap around your wrist during admission. The voices rose in volume, no longer muffled but crystal clear, and I realized with growing horror that I recognized them. Patients from my former clinic. Mrs. Henderson, who'd never regained full mobility after her stroke. Miguel Santos, who'd struggled with chronic pain. Sarah Chen, who'd died. No, Sarah Chen had moved away, transferred to another facility. That's what they'd told me. But as I stared into the impossible water, I began to remember other patients. Ones who'd stopped coming to sessions without explanation. Ones whose files had been quietly removed from my caseload. Ones whose breathing had grown labored during treatment, whose lungs had filled with fluid that no amount of therapy could drain. "You helped us let go," the voices sang in perfect harmony. "Now enter and return the breath you took from us." And suddenly I understood. The pool wasn't trying to harm me. It was trying to heal me. All those patients I couldn't save. All those final breaths I'd witnessed and cataloged and moved past. They'd found their way here, to this place where healing had once happened, where broken bodies had once been made whole. They were waiting for me to join them, to let the water fill my lungs the way it had filled theirs, to stop fighting the current that had always been pulling me under. The insurance job, the cataloging, even my presence here, none of it was coincidence. I'd been drawn here just as surely as those wet footprints had been drawn to my door. The water began to rise. It crept across the deck with deliberate patience, soaking through my shoes, climbing my legs with the warmth of a familiar embrace. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably my supervisor wondering why I hadn't filed my report. But the sound seemed to come from very far away, from a world where breathing was still necessary, where drowning was still possible. I took a step toward the pool's edge, then another. The voices welcomed me home, and for the first time in days, the silence finally had weight enough to let me rest. Story 14. The elevator buttons felt different under my fingertips that Sunday morning, colder than they should have been, with a texture like worn bone. I'd been managing the retrofit of the Brennan Commercial Building for 8 months, and every surface in this place had become familiar. Every surface except the button marked 2 that shouldn't have existed. I stared at it, my coffee growing cold in my other hand. The building plans were seared into my memory. 15 floors above ground, basement level, sub-basement for utilities. No negative second floor. Yet there it was, brass and real, nestled between the basement button and the emergency stop. The metal bore the same patina as the others, the same manufacturer's stamp, as if it had always belonged. My rational mind supplied explanations. Renovation fatigue, the early hour. 3 weeks of 12-hour days had blurred my perception, but my finger moved toward the button anyway, drawn by the kind of morbid curiosity that makes you probe a loose tooth with your tongue. The elevator lurched downward with a grinding that I'd never heard before. Metal against metal in a rhythm that sounded almost organic. The descent lasted too long, far longer than the drop to the sub-basement should have taken. The floor indicator flickered through familiar numbers, 3, 2, 1, B, SB, then something that made my vision swim before settling on 2. The doors opened with a pneumatic sigh. The corridor stretched before me, illuminated by fluorescent fixtures that hummed with the particular frequency of institutional anxiety. Concrete walls ran in both directions, their surfaces slick with moisture that caught the harsh light and threw it back like polished mirrors. I could see myself reflected infinitely in the undulating wetness. 1,000 versions of me in work clothes, each one slightly distorted, slightly wrong. My footsteps echoed as I stepped into the corridor, the sound bouncing off the wet walls with crystalline clarity. But there was something off about the acoustics. The echo of my right foot came back clean and sharp, but the left foot's echo returned with a subtle delay, half a second out of sync, creating a secondary rhythm that suggested someone walking behind me. I stopped. The echo stopped, but not immediately. There was that half-second delay, as if my shadow was taking an extra step before catching up. The air down here tasted of copper and old concrete, with an undertone of something organic that I couldn't identify. Not decay exactly, but something that had once been alive and was now suspended in an uncomfortable state between existence and absence. Each breath seemed to coat my lungs with moisture that was too warm, too thick. I walked to the left first, counting my steps. 23 paces brought me to a dead end where the corridor terminated in another concrete wall, this one bearing a small placard that read, "Authorized personnel only, 1974. The date meant nothing to me. The building had been constructed in 1981. Turning back, I passed the elevator and continued in the other direction. The walls here were identical, the same wet concrete, the same impossible reflections. But the reflections were becoming troublesome. In the undulating surface, my image seemed to lag behind my movements by fractions of seconds, creating a disconcerting effect like watching myself through water. This corridor terminated after 31 steps, ending at what appeared to be a maintenance door marked with radiation symbols and warnings in languages I didn't recognize. The metal was rust-free despite the humid environment, and when I touched it, it was warm. Not room temperature warm, but body warm, as if something living pulsed beneath the surface. I retreated to the elevator, but the call button wouldn't respond. The doors remained closed, and the floor indicator showed 2 in amber digits that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. I pressed the button repeatedly, but the only response was a clicking sound from somewhere within the walls. Not the mechanical click of electrical contacts, but something more organic, like fingernails on concrete. That's when I noticed the evacuation notice. It was taped to the right side of the elevator doors, a standard emergency procedures poster with the distinctive orange header of 1970s government printing. The paper was crisp, despite the humidity, as if it had been posted yesterday. At the bottom, under floor wardens, a list of names was printed in neat block letters. The third name down read, M. Stevens, in handwriting that looked exactly like mine. My hands shook as I examined the poster more closely. The date was clear. Issued September 15, 1974. The building hadn't existed in 1974. I hadn't existed in any meaningful professional capacity in 1974. I'd been in elementary school, yet there was my name, in my handwriting, on a document that predated my birth by several years. I ripped the poster from the wall, but underneath it was another identical poster, and beneath that, another. Each one bore the same date, the same list, the same impossible signature. I tore them down frantically, but they seemed to multiply faster than I could remove them, until the space around the elevator was carpeted with orange papers, all identical, all bearing my name in my own hand. The clicking sound intensified, echoing from the walls like a countdown. The moisture on the concrete began to move, forming patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols that appeared and dissolved before I could focus on them. The reflections in the walls started to move independently, showing versions of myself that gestured and turned their heads while I stood perfectly still. I hammered on the call button, and finally, mercifully, the elevator doors opened. The ride up felt normal. The familiar mechanical sounds, the expected duration. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I stumbled out into the lobby's familiar marble and glass environment. Sunlight streamed through the windows at exactly the angle it should for 9:30 a.m. on a Sunday in October. My coffee cup sat on the security desk where I'd left it, still warm. But as I walked toward the exit, I caught my reflection in the lobby's polished elevator doors. For just a moment, before the image resolved properly, I was somewhere else, standing in that wet concrete corridor, surrounded by orange papers with moisture dripping from walls that reflected infinite versions of myself. I drove home and spent the rest of the day researching the building's history. No mention of expansion below the sub-basement. No record of any structure on the site before construction began in 1980. The architectural firm's records showed no negative second floor in any iteration of the plans. Monday morning arrived with the particular anxiety that comes from knowing you have to return to a place where reality had bent. I avoided the elevators entirely, taking the stairs to my temporary office on the 3rd floor. But throughout the day, I found myself stealing glances at the elevator bank, watching the floor indicators. Several times I saw the amber 2 flickering in displays that should have shown only positive numbers and basement levels. My crew noticed my distraction. When Jim, my site foreman, asked if everything was all right, I found myself wanting to tell him about the corridor, the echoes, the impossible poster. But the words felt too large for my mouth, too strange for daylight hours. Instead, I made excuses about weekend stress and buried myself in renovation schedules. But the poster haunted me. Not just the impossibility of it, but the certainty of that handwriting. It wasn't similar to mine. It was mine, with all the particular loops and angles that I'd developed over decades of engineering notations. The pressure patterns, the slight right-hand slant, even the way I dotted my I's. Everything was perfectly, impossibly accurate. That evening, I called the building's previous owners, the management company that had overseen it before our client purchased it for renovation. The property manager, a tired-sounding woman named Carol, confirmed what I already knew. 15 floors, basement, sub-basement for mechanical systems. When I pressed her about any historical incidents, any evacuations or emergency procedures, she became evasive. There had been some issues in the early years, she admitted, but nothing that affected the current structure. What kind of issues? Look, Mr. Stevens, that building has had a lot of owners, a lot of managers. Sometimes records get incomplete. If you're having problems with the mechanical systems, I'd suggest checking with the original contractors. But she'd hung up before I could ask about evacuation procedures from 1974. Tuesday, I brought my building plans to work, the complete architectural set, including structural drawings that went back to the original 1980 construction. I spread them across my desk and traced every line, every dimension, every annotation. No negative second floor, no space unaccounted for. According to the structural drawings, the foundation terminated at the sub-basement level, with nothing but earth and bedrock below. Yet the button remained. I watched other people use the elevators throughout the day, studying their faces as they pressed the controls. No one seemed to notice the 2 button. When I asked Sarah from accounting which button she'd pressed for the basement, she pointed to the B without hesitation, her finger passing right over the 2 as if it weren't there. But it was there. I could see it, feel it. When I pressed it when no one was looking, it depressed with the same mechanical resistance as all the others. Wednesday, I brought a camera. The button photographed normally enough, a brass circle with 2 etched into its surface. But when I reviewed the image, something was wrong with the perspective. The elevator panel appeared to be photographed from a lower angle than where I'd been standing, as if the camera had been held by someone significantly shorter. And in the reflection on the brass surface, instead of my face behind the camera, there was just darkness. I deleted the photo immediately, but that night I woke up with the taste of copper and concrete in my mouth. Thursday I broke. I waited until the building was empty, then rode the elevator down to 2 again. This time I was prepared. I brought a flashlight, a measuring tape, and a rational plan to document everything systematically. If this was some kind of psychological breakdown, at least I could gather evidence of my own deterioration. The doors opened onto the same impossible corridor, but something had changed. The evacuation posters now covered more of the walls, overlapping in patterns that hurt to look at directly. They weren't just taped up anymore. They seemed to be growing from the concrete itself, erupting through the surface moisture like paper flowers. I walked the corridor again, measuring carefully. 23 steps to the left, 31 to the right. But when I turned around and retraced my path, the measurements were different. 18 steps, 27 steps. As if the space was contracting around me. The echoes of my footsteps had multiplied. Now it sounded like a crowd following me, dozens of footsteps in slightly different rhythms, all delayed by that same half-second interval. When I stopped walking, the sound continued for nearly 10 seconds, gradually fading like applause dying in a theater. I aimed my flashlight at the walls, trying to photograph the reflections, but the beam seemed to bend in the moisture-slick surface, creating impossible geometries. In the photographs, the corridor appeared to extend infinitely in both directions, with no dead ends visible. But the most disturbing discovery came when I examined the evacuation posters more closely. The list of names had changed. Where there had been perhaps a dozen names originally, now there were hundreds, all in different handwriting, all dated 1974, and they weren't random names. I recognized them. Contractors who had worked on the building retrofit, previous owners, Carol, the property manager I'd spoken with on the phone, even Jim, my site foreman. And at the top of every list, in handwriting that was unmistakably mine, M. Stevens, floor warden. Friday, I didn't go to work. I called in sick and spent the day at the public library, researching evacuation procedures from 1974. What I found made my skin crawl. In September of 1974, there had been a citywide emergency preparedness drill, part of a Cold War civil defense program. Buildings throughout the downtown area had posted evacuation procedures and assigned floor wardens, but the Brennan building hadn't existed in 1974. I found archived photographs of the site from that year, an empty lot with construction equipment for a project that had been delayed by permit issues. The building that eventually rose on that spot was completed 7 years later, to completely different specifications. Yet somehow the evacuation procedures existed. More than that, they had been followed. I found a newspaper article from October 1974 describing a highly successful emergency drill in which all designated buildings had evacuated their personnel according to posted procedures. The Brennan building was mentioned by name, along with its floor wardens, including M. Stevens. That night I dreamed of concrete corridors filled with water, of evacuation notices breeding like bacteria, of my own reflection walking independently through mirrored walls. I woke up with concrete dust under my fingernails, though I hadn't been near the construction site in over 24 hours. Saturday morning, I made a decision. I drove to the building, used my security code to enter, and went straight to the elevator. The 2 button seemed brighter now, almost luminous in the fluorescent light. I pressed it without hesitation. The descent felt different this time, faster, with a dropping sensation that suggested much greater depth than before. The floor indicator cycled through numbers I'd never seen. 3, 4, 5, continuing downward until the display showed only symbols that meant nothing to me. When the doors opened, I was somewhere else entirely. The corridor stretched in all directions now, a vast network of concrete passages that branched and intersected according to no architectural logic I could understand. The walls were covered entirely with evacuation notices, layer upon layer, creating a papier-mâché surface that rustled and whispered with the movement of air I couldn't feel. And I wasn't alone. Figures moved through the distant corridors, shadowy forms that walked with the same half-second echo that had plagued my footsteps. As they drew closer, I could see that they wore work clothes from different eras, carried clipboards and measuring instruments, moved with the purposeful stride of people with important work to complete. Floor wardens, all of them. Emergency personnel for a building that existed in the overlap between what had been planned and what had been built, in the space where bureaucratic necessity intersected with architectural impossibility. I understood then why my name had appeared on those evacuation notices, why my handwriting had signed documents that predated my birth. The building needed its floor wardens, needed its emergency personnel. It had reached through time to recruit them, pulling names from future renovations, future occupants, future disasters that had never quite occurred. As the figures approached, I could see their faces. Some were familiar, workers I'd supervised, inspectors I'd met, previous tenants of the building. Others were strangers, but they all wore the same expression of weary dedication, the look of people who had accepted a job that could never be completed. One of them handed me a clipboard. The pages were filled with inspection checklists for systems that didn't exist, emergency procedures for disasters that hadn't happened, floor plans for spaces that occupied the gaps between reality and necessity. I signed my name at the bottom of the form, my handwriting flowing across the page with practiced ease. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I heard the mechanical systems of the building settle around us like a satisfied sigh. Somewhere above, the renovation continued. Somewhere below, we maintained our vigil, ensuring the safety of occupants who might never arrive, following procedures that existed only in the intersection of planning and paranoia. I still go to work every day. I still manage the retrofit, coordinate with contractors, review architectural plans. But now I understand that there are 2 buildings occupying the same space, the one that exists and the one that was always supposed to exist. My job is to maintain the space between them, to ensure that the emergency procedures are always ready, always posted, always signed by hand in the specific penmanship that bridges past and future. The evacuation notices continue to appear. The names continue to multiply. And every Sunday when the building is empty, I ride the elevator down to 2 to check on our progress. After all, someone has to be the floor warden. Someone has to make sure we're ready for the emergency that's always coming, the disaster that never quite arrives, the evacuation that happens every day in the space between what is and what should be. The building depends on it. We all do.